The chef finally made a move, but it wasn't in the way Three-Eye Emperor predicted. Rather, she moved her empty left hand. The hand burst into a limb of bright fire. Swiftly, she looked as if she attempted to grab hold of Three-Eye Emperor's head. "Pa, you think you can catch me with that miserable speed?" Three-Eye Emperor, who had managed to avoid her reach, spoke to her with great disdain. Still, the chef looked incredibly powerful, and it was just her speed, in Three-Eye Emperor's special vision, where she looked very slow. Three-Eye Emperor readied himself to dodge a potential repeated try, but he suddenly felt as if he couldn't move. He was shocked, and in great wonder why this was, he looked down. And that's when he saw it. A giant fork had pierced through his entire body. He had been skewered with a dinner utensil at complete unawares. Three-Eye Emperor had no clue when the fork had appeared, but he knew he hadn't the time to mull this over, for he was as helpless as a chicken wing propped on a skewer above a barbecue flame. And then he realized she hadn't attempted to grab his head at all. She had just moved to grab the fork, and he had misinterpreted her move. This had been a costly mistake. She grabbed the handle of the large fork, the prongs of which had firmly pierced through Three-Eye Emperor's meaty body, and summoned a fire to envelop it. The flames themselves looked particularly hungry, as they began to creep upon Three-Eye Emperor's clothing and ravage the spirit. The flames settled on his flesh and began to sizzle and sear his body. He began to give off a wonderful aroma that tantalized the senses of the nose and got one's mouth drooling. Arg! Three-Eye Emperor began to writhe on the prongs of the fork in pain. It was agony, feeling himself get roasted alive in open flames. No matter how much he squirmed, he could not free himself. The best he could do was flail with his spear in hand, trying to strike the devilish chef. Then, the sound of a hungry dragon groaning was heard. Before he could respond and see where it might be coming from, his head was immediately assaulted with an ice cream scoop. Dragon Lady Chef scooped his third eye right out of its socket. The chef performed the action with sickening calmness. She was gentle and unconcerned, and she treated Three-Eye Emperor as if he was an ordinary slab of meat she had to prepare for dinner. One hand held the large fork, and the other held the utensil of choice. More often than not, the cleaver. Getting him to a nice golden color, Dragon Lady Chef then began the carving process. She peeled his skin and his flesh off with perfect precision, regardless of how much the roasted emperor tried wriggling around. This disgusting spectacle had drawn the attention of quite a few by now, and it made everyone ill. It was horrendous to see, and yet Dragon Lady Chef did not even blink once throughout the entire process. For some gut-wrenching reason, this seemed ordinary for her. Xie Qingqing watched her perform and then thought about the food she had frequently produced for him. When he tried to imagine the well-being of the ingredients she had used in past meals, he wanted to hurl. Two-Eye Emperor wanted nothing more than to die. The pain was excruciating, and he couldn't stand it a single second longer. All he could do was writhe around, drowning in the agony and tears. But the chef continued doing her thing, lopping and slicing all the perfectly cooked meat she could. She didn't seem likely to stop until there was nothing left but his bones. His cries rang loud across the expanse, growing in volume. Eventually, he could be heard echoing down the valleys for miles around. Spirits could respawn, yes, but it wasn't as if they forgot how their deaths came about. It would come as no surprise if they were to learn Two-Eye Emperor never recovered from this ordeal, and he'd be scarred forevermore. This was not something someone could ever forget. Han Sen, while this was ongoing, was still focused on the fight with No God Emperor and Ruin Emperor. He wasn't doing as well as he had imagined. No God Emperor hit him over and over, drawing more and more blood each time. It was like he was accepting a lashing. Ruin Emperor beat him until he was black and blue, seemingly enjoying every single punch he could deliver. Han Sen was up against the two strongest emperors in the Third God Sanctuary. While he was perfectly capable with dealing with them, he had submitted to accepting all the pain they could deliver. Jadeskin was strong, but it was not indestructible. Gritting his teeth to withstand the beating, Han Sen did not let the pain affect his mind. He hissed, "Yeah, that's right. Beat me. Beat me like you beat your fat wife." Han Sen wanted this because of the tantalizing feelings he received as he was being hurt. Most attacks never made him feel this way, but through the pounding given by those two strong emperors, he felt remarkable. He had to feel like he was going to be torn in two, and it took the sort of pain no God Emperor and Ruin Emperor could inflict to make him feel this way. With 10 gene locks of jade skin, not even an emperor could kill him, despite the free pummeling he was offering them. It was rare to receive such strong attacks repeatedly and remain alive and well. No God Emperor and Ruin Emperor were able to cycle through a variety of different methods to make Han Sen feel the pain he wanted to feel, and they focused on what hurt the most. And while this was good for them, they didn't know this was what Han Sen wanted. Onlookers believed he was getting wrecked and destroyed by the two emperors, but little did they know Han Sen wanted it this rough. He was cherishing every second of the pain. Han Sen's Dongxian aura had maxed out, but he still hadn't been able to open his 10th gene lock. But on this day, while receiving the pain they inflicted, he felt his cells become invigorated. There was activity and excitement in his body he had not felt for a long time. He thought his cells were as small as they could be already, but after the 10th gene lock finally broke, they became even smaller. And those shattered cells looked incredibly special beneath the light of the Dongxian aura. Han Sen felt as if the entire world was different now. With Dongxian aura this way, the entire world seemed foreign and fantastic. It felt new. Han Sen saw everything in a completely different light. He could observe the smallest detail of the smallest thing in the environment. He could study blades of grass at a molecular level. This vision he now had was almost scary. Nothing escaped his attention anymore, and he himself knew no details would go unnoticed. Han Sen made a comparison in his mind, likening it to the sight of a beautiful woman going at it with another man. Other men would only see the shape of a beautiful woman, but he could not only see every pore and imperfection on her skin, but the bacteria that existed on her. With Dongxian aura like this, the entire world looked primitive. I can see through everything? Is that what the true meaning of the Dongxian Sutra seeks to imply? Han Sen felt as if he had broken through something most remarkable, and while it was brilliant, it made him feel as if he wasn't human anymore. Ruin Emperor and No God Emperor's attacks now looked extremely strange to Han Senator. Their bodies were no longer solid. Their movements came with a flurry of colored dots around them, which Han Sen had trouble understanding right now. He believed them to be representations of power, or maybe even the smell of the emperors. In Han Sen's vision, it soon became clear they had also been built this way too. He could see right through them, as if they were just vectors and wireframe polygons. If I break the structure of these beings, what would happen? Han Sen thought to himself as he looked on them. Han Sen reached out to No God Emperor, who was now little more than binary code given physical form and shape. He reached out and tried to break him. With the 10th gene lock of the Dongxian Sutra open, everything felt different. The coursing of power in and around him felt tangible, and it all provided him a strange, yet wondrous sensation. In Dongxian aura, his own body became a sequential structure of sorts. This was what he saw himself as, all except for his hands. Before his hands came into contact with No God Emperor, the spirit's No God sword was bearing down on Han Sen's head. Han Sen brought his hand up as a barrier to brace against the sword. No God's sword also looked like a sequential structure to his eyes now, but one that was different than his own. Everything around had a sequence structure, but everything was individual and unique. The sequences all ran separate to one another, but when seen all together, they seemed to run in perfect harmony. When Han Sen's fingers unfurled and closed back down on the No God sword, his hand was able to break one of the sequences. The process, to Han Sen's newfound vision, was like the tipping of a domino. And when that first sequence broke, the others quickly followed. Others saw things the same as always, but what they saw still wowed them and had them look on at something most incredible. In Han Sen's hand, they saw the No God sword crumble to dust and scatter to the wind. Everyone around, No God Emperor and Ruin Emperor included, looked at what had occurred in audible shock. Each and everyone gasped, not thinking such a thing was possible. They thought Han Sen was going to die soon, submitting to their constant pummeling. Yet despite all that, they saw a man who had nearly been broken rise up from the ashes like a phoenix. They watched him grab his aggressor's sword and break it. And of course, no god sword was not just any ordinary sword. Chills ran down all their spines. Han Sen could hardly believe it either. He was still bewildered by the rush of how things had changed, following the opening of the 10th gene lock. It was nearly scary. What was going on? Now I know how Dong Xianzi was able to break through the vacuum, Han Sen said to himself, as his own mouth gasped at the realization. Ruin Emperor then followed up. Swinging his fist towards Senator Han Sen grabbed his fist and broke the sequence he could see, which nearly obliterated his entire body. Cracks in his very form had quickly webbed their way across him. Then, as if the action had been effortless, the cracks widened and collapsed. Ruin Emperor crumbled into dust, just as the sword had. Silence. Total silence. Everyone was silent following that, struggling to comprehend the fact that the all-supreme Ruin Emperor had been killed through one punch. And that punch had been so powerful, the spirit had crumbled into little more than ash. It was all over. The spirits now knew there was no hope for them to remain there, and so they all began to flee. They scarpered back to wherever they came from. When Ruin Emperor died, Han Sen and his companions got their original powers back, too. No God Emperor looked at Han Sen with a face drained of all color. He too wished to flee, as he had once done before. No God Emperor tried teleporting away, but Han Sen was quicker on the draw. He used Ghost Slash. Impossible! No God Emperor himself then suffered the same fate, turning to dust as his sword and Ruin Emperor had. Han Sen's companions did not spring into action, as might be expected, upon the return of their abilities. Instead, they each just remained still, like statues. They looked at Han Sen as if he was a monster, not their strong and righteous leader as he long had been. And eventually, their eyes turned to Han Sen's hands. To them, they were magic hands. With all the spirits running off, it was expected of them to chase after the spirits they could. But so grand and baffling was Han Sen's deed, they forgot to go after them. It had slipped Moment Queen's mind entirely. What in the sanctuaries was that power? Flower Empress asked East Empress. Ruin Emperor and No God Emperor were the strongest spirits in the sanctuary, and despite facing them both simultaneously, Han Sen had managed to one-hit kill the both of them. Honestly, I don't know. For the first time in a long time, I don't know. East Empress actually looked frightened as she spoke, and her lips trembled to utter her response. Heavenly Empress then found herself having to ask the obvious question. Can any spirit beat him? Is there anyone left we can call upon? Yes, there is. The king. Flower Empress quickly proclaimed, convinced the spirit of her sleepless nights was just out there somewhere. She did her best to convince herself he was their last hope, and one day he would re-emerge, ready to defeat Han Sen. I hope you're right about that. If you're not, and there truly is no other, spirits of the third god's sanctuary are in danger. We could very well face extinction, Heavenly Empress said, half entertaining Flower Empress' strained belief. The news of Han Sen being able to one-hit kill Ruin Emperor and No God Emperor in a duel against them both was heard throughout the third god's sanctuary. No one knew what the power Han Sen had employed was, so others came up with a name for it instead. Super Spank. Spirits called it Super Spank, for he had slapped No God Emperor and Ruin Emperor to death. Many spirits were worried now, for they knew there was no competing against Han Senator if he came for their territories. There'd be no hope of resisting. And when the news reached the Alliance, no one believed it. A few hundred spirits and creatures had amassed to attack Han Sen's shelter, and having laid waste to such numbers, Han Sen had also then gone on to kill No God Emperor. Humans did not know about Ruin Emperor, but they did know about No God Emperor through Divinity's bout. They knew how terrifying he was, and the thought of Han Sen felling him with ease seemed like a stretch. While people were quick to disregard the news at first, it soon became clear it was no lie. And what's more, the news was heard through the chattering of spirits, and there'd be no reason for spirits to lie about this. If anything, repeating the story was doing them a disservice. No God Emperor Super spanked to death. Good bad. He's the guy with the super spank, the one emperor to rule them all. Han Sen did not return to the Alliance yet, though. First, he wanted to conquer the entirety of the third god's sanctuary. After Night Empress aided Han Sen and Lotus Empress by killing numerous emperors, and after the events that had just transpired at Moving Star Shelter, the third god's sanctuary was now at its most vulnerable. Han Sen was unstoppable, and the remaining spirits knew this. None would dare get in his way, and so they all obeyed Han Sen and provided him with their spirit stones when he started making rounds. Before what had just occurred, they would never obey a human, but Han Sen was too intimidating. And to them, he wasn't just a mere human like the rest were. He had a unique reputation of terror. Areas that had not been controlled by Han Sen yet discussed how they might fight back and revolt, but they all secretly knew it would be futile. Han Sen took a break after a while and went to the spirit base as a Super King spirit. It had been a while since he last played the part of the king. Inside the 9th spirit base, a few spirits were discussing amongst themselves. Six-Arm, did you hear about the human and his super spank? What a silly question. Of course I have. It destroyed both Ruin Emperor and No God Emperor. The human has been expanding the reach of his territory following that, hasn't he? I wonder what powers he practiced to be able to do what he did. I have heard some spirits have tried to resist him and have refused to pledge their allegiance to the man when he came to their shelters. Needless to say, they were quickly struck down. He's merciless. If it goes on like this, he'll soon end up claiming the entirety of the third god's sanctuary. You worry far too much, far too soon. It won't be as easy for him as he thinks. He is a human, and those who accompany him are spirits and creatures. He treats them well, but when he claims a shelter, the spirit that previously owned the place is put under a contract with one of his close allies. There is no such thing as an invincible foe. Powers have a limit. There must be some way we can fight back and break him. Undead Emperor and the King still haven't tried their hands yet. Undead Emperor never dies, and the King has an incredible amount of power, or at least he did, last we saw him. If he had 10 gene locks open, he might be able to win. Don't jump the gun just yet. I'm sure it will still take the King some time before he opens his 10th gene lock. You and I both know the King is vastly different than most spirits. He is delightfully unpredictable, and it would not surprise me if he already had opened his 10th gene lock. As they spoke, a new island appeared at the spirit base. The King's spirits looked over to see who was coming, and it was the person they had just been discussing. Han Senator, of course, they wouldn't recognize him as such. The King's spirits drove their island towards Han Sen and asked him, "The King, have you heard about the human?" Han Sen took a moment before responding, thinking to himself, well, duh. That's me. You numpties. Of course, he was far politer to them than that when he spoke. And wanting to have some fun, he smiled and told them, "That is why I am here. I need to open my 10th gene lock as soon as possible, so I can kill him." The spirits were enthusiastic, hearing this. They immediately said, "You can break Super Spank? I have skill negation. To fight and destroy the boy, all I need is my 10th gene lock to be open," Han Sen said. "How do you plan on opening it?" "You can't take too long," a King's spirit asked. "I need to fight to open it, and I need all sorts of spirit geno points," Han Sen feigned. "I have water element. I can give you those points so you can kill the human," one King's spirit offered. "Yeah, I do need some. It would be wonderful to receive some of those." Han Sen was thrilled, for he had played them like a fiddle. This was exactly what he had come to do, and they had fallen for his bait, hook, line, and sinker. It was normally difficult to gather King's spirit geno points, and he could only receive 1 point for each kill. Plus, the last time he had come here, King's spirits tended to avoid him. They didn't like his pompous attitude, and neither did they like the fact he'd always one-hit kill them. Now, they thought they needed him, so their tunes had changed. King's spirits began to line up, one after each other. They were all dying to give him their geno points so he could challenge Han Senator, and the offerings weren't measly, either. They often gave more than just a handful. This was the 9th spirit base, so the King's spirits around often possessed 900 geno points. Maxing out the figure to 100 would not be too difficult for him. "I have thunder geno points. I will give you as many as you need, but please kill the human." "Me too." The queue was a messy one, as spirits impatiently wished to provide the King all the geno points they could offer. "I will take your earth geno points. There is no need for more fire. but I also need someone to help me practice in combat. As Han Sen watched his king's spirit geno point tally steadily increase, he was exuberantly happy. Every now and again, Han Sen came to the spirit base to collect a few points where he could and practice combat. He had never been beaten, for he utterly annihilated all his challengers with the greatest of ease. It was for this particular reason the spirits believed the king would be the person to beat Han Sen, and before long, his king's spirit geno points were maxing out, one after each other, element after element. Han Sen was now able to maximize his efficiency with wind, fire, thunder, and lightning. He wasn't as effective with them as he would be if he was a professional that trained with one element exclusively, but he was nothing to laugh at. The reason Han Sen wanted to collect and better his elemental powers so much, though, was because of his desire to hammer out new, complex hyper-geno arts. And that was what was great about humanity. Han Sen was in a fine, cheery mood, but the spirits around weren't. They had no idea Han Sen was the king, and the king was Han Sen. He initially feared encountering Sky King or the Lady with Serpent Throne, but fortunately for him, they did not show up. If they did, he believed they could expose him. They had seen Han Sen don the appearance of the king when he activated Super King Spirit Mode. That being said, they had 10 gene locks open, and once Han Sen's Super King Spirit Mode opened its 10th gene lock, the chance of having an awkward encounter with them was far higher. As long as he kept away from them, and they could not see the king's appearance, Han Sen wagered he'd be fine. Han Sen hoped they had never even heard of the king, but that might have been unlikely. At the very least, he hoped they didn't like spending time in the spirit base. He didn't think many people would believe them, though, even if they did try to expose the king as being Han's senator, it was a stretch to believe, and it'd be his word against theirs. Plus, it wasn't as if they could challenge him. He had maxed out his geno points, too. Shortly after, Han Sen had managed to claim over 1 million miles of land for humans. Unfortunately, there were hardly any humans in a position to handle the shelters and land, so he had to allow spirits to remain alive and serve as stewards for the time being. The spirits were right in this assumption. When they feared Han Sen's takeover, they guessed he would need to keep the spirits alive to handle matters. And aside from saving humans, he couldn't actually take over and rule the third god's sanctuary. It just wasn't feasible. Spirits gained power at a decent, steady rate. But humans had always been slow in the third god's sanctuary, and although things were better now, they'd still take a long time to gain what was necessary to start ruling the lands Han Sen had claimed. Han Sen was currently resting in a shelter. He was asleep, but he was roused from his slumber by the detection of someone near. Someone not very familiar to him had entered his private garden. With Han Sen's heightened senses, he knew that person had to be powerful if he had only now just been noticed. God's retribution? It was God's retribution, one of the 13 members of Blood Legion. God's retribution seemed to be at ease, and he sat down gently, saying, "Super Spank? Ah, that's a good one. I got lucky. And besides, I didn't name it that," Han Sen said, unsure of the relationship that was supposed to exist between them. "I've heard it's your goal to take over the third god's sanctuary," God's retribution said, with a smile. "Well, you've heard right," Han Sen said. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," God's retribution said. "It's fortunate you're not me. But tell me why?" Han Sen asked. God's retribution looked over to the pool of water and told him, "Blood Legion knew about super geno points, and we've been killing super creatures since long before the existence of them became common knowledge. We didn't inform humanity about any of it. Do you know why that is?" Han Sen was not surprised they could gather super geno points with the strength they had. They were far stronger than average humans, after all, and it'd be baffling to hear them say they had never killed one before. Han Sen was curious about what the man was looking to tell him, though. So, he played along and said, "No." "Why?" God's retribution explained, "Humans are actually the invaders of this place. By coming to the sanctuaries, humans broke the balance. Typical human behavior, really, like parasites. Although there is an abundance of resources, creatures, and spirits here, we slowly break the balance established in these realms. Before, when humans were unable to slay super creatures, things were already bad. After their slaying of those became common, we hit a slippery slope. The ecosystems of the sanctuaries are suffering. Han Sen frowned and said, creatures can nest and shoot out more babies, can't they? Do you know how many years it takes to produce an egg? And if you do you know how many eggs have been broken since your lie? 2 centuries down the line we are currently treading, humans will be fighting each other for super geno points. God's retribution was genuinely concerned, and it appeared to grieve him to speak of these matters. After a lengthy pause and sigh, he went on to say, and a lot of that has to do with you. You're a remarkable person, I must tell you. But you're speeding up this process, a process that will only lead to ruin. If you continue doing what you're doing, this will happen faster than it did for the first God's sanctuary. Blood Legion didn't tell anyone on purpose to avoid this from happening? I'd consider that noble, if it wasn't also selfish, Han Sen said. God's retribution responded to the slight, explaining, we were delaying the inevitable. We knew it was only a matter of time before the existence of super creatures and life genoessences were found out, and we just wanted to make these ecosystems last. You've heard it before, surely, but humans really are horrible creatures. Their mistreatment in this sanctuary was a well-needed humbling. Everywhere else we're parasites, invading one place until it's sucked dry, before multiplying and bringing the same fate elsewhere. Take a look at the first God's sanctuary, and you'll see what I mean. What a sorry sight that place is in recent times. There must be something we can do to alleviate the issue, surely, Han Sen said. God's retribution said, if humans insist on becoming part of the cycle, adjustments can be made. But like I said, we were delaying the inevitable, and whether or not we can truly be a part of things in the sanctuaries and coexist with the current laws, I can't say for certain. He went on to reassert his meaning by again saying, humans have upset the balance of the sanctuaries. The first God's sanctuary is bad enough as it is, but you are making things worse. You said that already. But what if I decide to continue down the road I'm currently headed? What would you plan to do about that? Han Sen asked, needling God's retribution to learn as much as he could about what he wanted. I won't stop you. The trail you blaze is your own, but with how people see you, you should set a better example. If your heirs are one day killing each other for a measly scrap of flesh, you can't roll in your grave and say we didn't warn you, God's retribution said, then turned to leave. Han Sen thought he'd be threatened, and he readied himself for a fight. With his strength now, he was keen to stress the limits of how powerful Blood Legion members truly were. Han Sen did not expect him to immediately say his piece and then leave. He thought the encounter had been rather strange, and his perception of Blood Legion had been altered somewhat after it. He thought Blood Legion was an evil, slightly scary organization, but they were obviously concerned for the overall trajectory humanity was headed on. Blood Legion cared about the environment like the people of Greenpeace, and the thought of those two organizations sharing similar goals was something he was struggling to comprehend. Go to the fourth God's sanctuary. I'll be waiting for you there, and when we do next meet, let's hope it won't be his enemies. God's retribution swiftly left after saying this. Han Sen now understood these were his parting words, and the only chance they'd have to speak before his departure to the fourth God's sanctuary. This was God's retribution's goodbye. He must be making a mockery of me, Han Sen ultimately thought to himself, following the strange encounter with God's retribution. He made it sound as if he was doing it for the children, but Han Sen thought it was a ploy of some sort. He thought he had been lied to, and that there was an ulterior motive behind his words of concern. He thought he was being a hypocrite or a Pharisee, like a person that attends vegetarian rallies but still goes home and enjoys a good steak. He had been told that Blood Legion didn't want others to kill super creatures, as it would upset the balance. But Han Sen knew they must have had to kill a lot of super creatures themselves to maintain the strength their members had achieved. What they were doing was pretty much what Han Sen himself did, he thought. Han Sen was never entirely truthful about how he went about things, but at the end of the day, much of what he did was for the betterment of mankind. He was still leaving things in good shape for others, who would one day carry the mantles he himself established. He was paving the way for others, whereas Blood Legion were only concerned with themselves. It was true, Han Sen hadn't thought about the long-term, negative effects and what things might be like for the next few generations, But it wasn't as if Blood Legion had the concerns of such eventualities at heart, either. Blood Legion was different, too. Their lineage and the strengthening of their next of kin was different than how ordinary born and bred humans were reproduced. Having an heir was a priority and chief concern for the members of Blood Legion. God's retribution had tried to disillusion Han Sen. They make themselves sound so righteous, but deep down, they're as dastardly and wicked as can be, Han Sen thought to himself. While God's retribution might have had his own interests at heart, some of the things he mentioned really would become legitimate concerns in the future. If Han Sen did kill creatures at a rate quicker than they could reproduce, things really would be a struggle further down the line. The flesh of creatures was needed, and if there weren't any creatures left to eat, things would be dire. Han Sen rubbed the temples of his head in thought over the state of things. He still wanted his primary focus to rest on bringing the third god's sanctuary to its knees. He needed to save humanity and allow his mother and Ji Yanran to enter the third god's sanctuary without worry. But to do that, he had to ensure he could do so without killing too much of the local population. He couldn't mass murder creatures as he saw fit. If humans became the majority, that would be quite worrisome. It truly was like an invasion, now that Han Sen thought about it. In the little time they had access to the sanctuaries, they had done a lot. Even Han Sen was willing to admit humans were greedy, he himself included. Some were greedier than others, but it was an inherent trait of mankind that humans were greedy things that always wanted more. During the interstellar era, everything was a resource and every resource was wanted. And the spending of resources always outpaced the influx of resources too. With a desire for ownership of worthless items, silly hobbies and such, a lot of resources were wasted. The resources taken didn't all go to the long-term betterment of mankind. And it seemed ironic to think the more civilized humans became, the more waste would be produced. Civilization seemed to equal lavish expenditure that only came at the cost of the planets that were ravaged for the necessary components to feed and keep the flames stoked. Han Sen thought man had become so in love with greed, they had forgotten themselves and found only appetites. Back in the Alliance, Han Sen turned off his phone and had a meal with his mother. If Han Sen turned it on, it'd undoubtedly be ringing 24/7. And the buzz of constant messages and notifications would shake the foundations of the building. When he defeated No God Emperor, all the factions wanted to cooperate with him. They all wanted to help Han Sen manage the shelters he had procured. Of course, they cared more for themselves than they did for a genuine cooperative venture with Han Senator. They'd earn a lot for themselves by having joint ownership of a number of shelters. This also played a part in why Han Sen chose not to return to the Alliance for quite a while. He knew he'd be hounded by fat cats and corporate jellyfish day and night. Also, they could line their own pockets with further unnecessary amounts of cash. Han Sen was going to just let the Ji family handle the issue and save himself the trouble. Ji Ruajin had even come to tell Han Sen, "You have to let some of them go." The Ji family did not want to take over the third god's sanctuary exclusively, as that would almost make them seem like a dictatorship. The sanctuary might then be viewed as a police state, forever under the watchful eyes of Big Brother Ruajin. They'd be hated. Ji Ruajin wanted Han Sen to give many of them up for distribution amongst a number of different companies and corporations, as well as families. He would lose a lot of potential money that way, but he would earn a lot of friends in return. "It looks like I really can't take over the third god's sanctuary myself." It sounded like Godslayer Luo might have been able to, but it seems he conquered even less than I have, Han Sen thought to himself. Han Sen didn't want to give up what he had earned, though, and he then said to himself, "Fine, if I can't claim ownership of more as Han Sen, then I'll just have to take them over with a different name." After a while, Han Sen stopped his ventures of expansion to focus on something else. He wanted to go off in search of Geno treasures that could increase his self-Geno points. He needed to open his Super King Spirit's 10th gene lock, after all. Ji Ruajin, in the meantime, ran through his contacts, trying to determine the best partners he could cooperate with. A month later, Han Sen had achieved 1,000 self-Geno points and managed to open the 10th gene lock of Super King Spirit Mode. It only increased the power of Super King Spirit Mode across the board, and there were no new, special traits earned. Super King Spirit Mode was very plain, but that was part of the attraction. It made you far stronger, and that was it. It was that simple. The greatest benefit of it now, though, was that he could remain in this form forever. There was no longer an annoying timer he had to adhere to. After opening his 10th gene lock, he decided to pay another visit to the spirit base. When Han Sen entered, though, he was unable to find any other islands. Han Sen chalked it up to there not being many spirits with 10 gene locks open, so as a result, there weren't going to be many to find there. Han Sen drove his island around for a while and eventually saw another spirit. He didn't reveal himself, though. Only seeing one, he just turned around and left. After that, Han Sen returned to the sanctuary and went back to conquering lands and claiming territories alongside the spirits and creatures in his employ. This news was relayed across the alliance once more, making people even more hyped for the prospects of proper settlement in the third god's sanctuary. The spirits were all cooperating, and they no longer resisted. On the sly, though, they still pleaded for Undead Emperor to help them out and defeat Han Sen. Before Sky Mountain, Undead Emperor began leading a grand host of spirits and creatures to bring an end to Han Sen's reign. Han Sen, will you fight me? Undead Emperor asked, with a tone as chilling as a winter's grave. Of course I will. Han Sen raced towards him, airborne. Undead Emperor was given a lot of information about Han Sen by the other spirits, so his expectations had already been realistically set. The spirits called upon Undead Emperor to help slay Han Sen due to his undying body, but just like always, the results shocked them. The previously thought to be indestructible body of Undead Emperor was utterly annihilated by Han Sen's slap. Mankind had won that round, as well. And after Han Sen claimed the mountain, humanity began to celebrate another job well done. But all of a sudden, a light shone in the sky high above. The ground began to shake, quake, and rumble. Tears formed across the region through subterranean explosions. It was like a coming apocalypse, and it frightened the onlookers. Aside from where Han Sen was, the land was churned into utter ruin and carnage. The mountains around collapsed into themselves, sinking down into black pits. Eventually, only Sky Mountain remained, surrounded by abyssal depths. The humans that saw this felt a great chill. Where the encompassing regions went, they had no clue, but the only relief they could feel was the belief they had been spared somehow. There are words written across the black reaches that surround us, a person called out. When the people turned to take a look, they read it out. It said, "We fight in 3 days. Yours sincerely, the king." Everyone looked at the chasm with worry. It was a sinister way to send a message, and even though they had full confidence in Han Sen, they couldn't help but feel afraid. Han Sen was their only lifeline. If he was defeated, things would go back to how they once were, as nobody else could carry his flame. The news that the king had challenged Han Sen was all over the third god's sanctuary. While this greatly excited the spirits, humans were less enthusiastic about the concept. If a human like Han Sen was defeated, progress in the third god's sanctuary would revert back to zero. Mankind would lose their entire grip on what they had obtained there thus far, and would most likely be treated even worse. And with the spectacle that accompanied the invitation, of entire lands being sunken, the fear of Han Sen losing grew. They started to believe Han Sen did not have what it took to defeat the king. The 3 days passed by quickly, and all that while, humans worried. But now, the day for that fateful fight had come. On the day of battle, Han Sen ventured to the peak of Sky Mountain and stood proudly. He waited there for the king to show. Although humans were tinged with a bit more worry than the spirits, they were all excited to see and hear what the result would be. Eventually, a body that looked like the king arrived. And after that, the area turned black. Nobody could see or hear a thing. A second later, everything returned to how it was. When they looked up again, they were all shocked at what they saw. Han Sen and the king were gone. Neither of them could be seen, and the mountaintop had vanished as well. The trail of a battle was found, though one that extended all the way to the endless sea. Although no one had seen the battle unfold, the markings of what had occurred looked bad. It must have been a brutal tussle. When the wake of combat reached the endless sea, none dared traverse the place. The gravity issue was bad enough, but the tsunamis that raged were frightening. 7 days later, the rage of the endless sea was quelled. Although nothing of the fight could actually be seen, It was hailed as the most epic and legendary fight ever performed by a human. The Alliance decided to call it the final fight, but no one yet knew who won the battle. The Alliance said Han Sen had won, but the spirits said the king had won. The battle had stopped, and Han Sen and the king established a contract. There were 3 core pillars of the contract. It stated that humans who were sent to spirit shelters were allowed to return to the Alliance. Han Sen would also provide spirits near absolute freedom, as long as they did not venture past Sky Mountain and left those lands alone. To the east of Sky Mountain was land solely belonging to mankind. Spirits were not allowed to go there. A lot of factions agreed with the contents of the contract, and it seemed like the best of both worlds. At the very least, it meant every surpasser had been freed. Han Sen had also secured 1,000,000 miles square of land for humans to occupy and live freely in. The Alliance was worried that if Han Sen died or had to leave the sanctuary, they would lose everything he had secured. As a result, they greatly agreed with the terms of the contract. The king became a hero to the spirits of the third god's sanctuary. When Undead Emperor was killed, all hope was lost. And yet, the king did not shy away from the battle. He went up and battled Han Sen alone. And hearing humans were no longer allowed to go past Sky Mountain, they were delighted. Some people believe the king might have actually been the elusive dollar, but few agreed with that theory. Spirits did not believe the king was a human, and humans did not believe dollar was a spirit. Han Sen knew the contract had no power, though. When he ascended to the fourth god's sanctuary, it would be rendered nullified. He only hoped the terms could be respected going forward. So, Han Sen used this opportunity to bring Ji Yanran and his mother to the third god's sanctuary. His mother was sent to a place in the human lands, whereas Ji Yanran was sent to a shelter that belonged to the dominion of spirits. But because of the terms of the contract, Ji Yanran was allowed to return to the Alliance and let Han Sen know where she was. Then, Han Sen was able to go there and bring her to where it was safe. Han Sen gave the pair a bunch of life geno essences to give them a head start. Han Sen did not aid the other humans much, though. He wanted them to become strong by themselves, for that would be true strength they'd be earning. Han Sen's subordinates became guards for shelters, but they wouldn't join any battles. Han Sen brought a few of the people he knew back to the underground shelter, too, unbeknownst to some. Han Sen let his mother handle many things there, while he took the time to focus on what was necessary for him if he wished to reach the fourth god's sanctuary. Han Sen also wondered over what Dragon King had told him about the special gene lock that might or might not exist. He had opened the 10th gene lock on 3 of his abilities, but he didn't feel anything remotely close to what Dragon King had described to him. Han Sen wished to figure it out before ascending, which aligned with the Alliance's desire of wanting him to remain for a while, too. When Han Sen returned home, he received a letter. Much to his surprise, it had been written with an actual pen. Han Sen opened the envelope, and soon after, he began to tremble. Han Sen recognized his father's handwriting due to the vast number of family documents and possessions he had collected and perused over the years. The letter he had received had been written and sent by his father. There was no room for doubt. It was easy to fake someone's handwriting, but the content contained information only he and his father would know about. And near the end of the letter, he read something that was most shocking. When Blind Man provided Han Sen the cauldron, there was a pill inside. He claimed it was a gift from his father, and his consumption of it was of absolute importance. He was told to eat it before becoming a demigod, due to its ability to aid him in unlocking something. This gene lock was not associated with the average 10 gene locks, and he had been told it'd be of great benefit for when he finally did become a demigod. Han Sen had the sudden thought that this was connected with the mystic gene lock Dragon King had told him about. The letter concluded with a profound apology for his absence, and how, as much as he wished he could not come back. After finishing the letter, Han Sen's mind was in a bit of a jumble. He believed it really had been written by his father, but it wasn't as if Han Sen missed him dearly over the years. Traditionally, all the best cowboys had daddy issues they need to confront and work on, but Han Sen never felt a longing for his father. He had learned to become very independent, and he was used to being alone, and often enjoyed the solace that came with it. Even if the pill was given to him by his father, He wasn't going to just take it because his parent had returned from the grave to tell him so. He still wanted to look into it more, through his own means. But the letter also mentioned there was a way in which you could find out whether that lock had been opened yet or not. And finding out was not difficult. So, wanting to conduct the test, Han Sen asked a few spirits to be of service in this endeavor. In the letter, it was said the 9-life cat pendant had to be used as an apparatus of sorts for the test he was going to conduct. After a lengthy search, he was unable to find any spirits who had opened this lock. Han Sen couldn't bring himself to perform the test on himself, either. So, he summoned Moment Queen and asked her to prick her own finger and draw a drop of her blood across the 9-life cat pendant. After the blood fell upon the cat's mouth, it seemed to then get absorbed. The pendant was solid, not unlike a gemstone, but somehow, it absorbed the blood as if it were a sponge. Then, a little later, the 9-life cat turned blue. The remnant of the blood it had soaked it had also turned blue. A little while later, the red blood that had turned blue turned back to being red. This was just as the letter said would happen. If Moment Queen had opened that special lock, then the blood would have stayed red the entire time. But Han Sen wasn't going to leave it like that. Tests had to be conducted a number of times before the results could be considered reliable. So, he went out and performed the same exercise with a variety of different creatures, spirits, and humans. It was very reliable, and the same response was received each and every time. The blood would turn blue, and that was that. Even Queen's blood was like this. Han Sen decided to try it himself. He pricked his finger and let a drop of blood descend onto the pendant. He expected it to turn blue, but much to his surprise, it seemed to remain red the entire time. Han Sen was not sure what to think at first, but he eventually told himself, "Does this mean I have opened that lock? But when did I do that? Is there something wrong with this pendant? Did I do the test incorrectly?" Han Sen went out in search of others to reconduct the test. The results he received were the same as before, and Han Sen's blood was the only blood that stayed red upon the pendant the entire time. Another lock, huh? Is it referring to the life door? Han Sen recalled the feeling of unlocking something when he opened the life door. But ever since that day, he had not noticed anything different. He didn't think it had aided him at all. If the 9-life cat was indeed performing correctly, though, there was no other possibility. So, I've opened that thing by accident. That's great. It means I don't even need to take that pill. Han Sen paused, pleased with himself. Then, after a brief bob of his head, he continued on to think, if I give this to someone else, then who should have it? Han Sen wasn't sure if the pill was safe, so if it was something harmful, he didn't want it to bring grief to someone that was dear to him. But if it was something decent, he didn't want to give it to a random nobody, either. It was quite the conundrum. Han Sen returned to the underground shelter and fetched the dusty cauldron. He called over Little Angel, Little Silver, and Thorn Queen. They sat at the table and wondered what Han Sen was planning to do with them. Han Sen placed the cauldron at the center of the table and slowly revealed the pill he had kept inside. Thorn Queen frowned, indicating she had no clue what it was. Little Angel looked at it, but did not show any emotion. Perhaps she was uninterested. Han Sen did not know. The silver fox looked ready to eat it, but someone else was faster. Bauer was on Han Sen's shoulder at the time, and as soon as she saw it, she leaped down onto the table and gobbled it up. Han Sen looked very nervous, hoping nothing bad would befall his baby. But after Bauer ate it, nothing occurred. She shivered a little, but that was it. Han Sen had tried the pendant test with Bauer earlier, but her blood had turned blue. A while later, he decided to take another pinch of her blood. This time, when the blood dripped onto the pendant, it stayed red. Han Sen stared at his 9-life cat for a while longer. It confirmed to him that the pill was genuine and that it would have helped him open the special gene lock. The nature of that lock, however, was a different question entirely. He paid extra attention to Bauer following this, but he did not notice any changes in her behavior or abilities. It was exactly the same thing that occurred to Han Sen himself, following his opening of the life door. "I'm glad you're okay," Han Sen told her with much relief. He hadn't wanted to endanger her. Han Sen then spent most of his time practicing the Blood Pulse Sutra. He had settled on becoming a demigod once he opened its 10th gene lock. He wasn't worried about his absence in the third god's sanctuary. He had done the best he could, with the ploy of crafting a contract signed by him and the king. He didn't think the spirits would violate the contract once he left. The territory he had established for humans was only 1 million miles squared, so it wasn't all that much, anyway. And besides, Han Sen had a number of super creatures and emperors that would remain when he was gone. They'd help protect everything Han Sen had done, and Queen and Qin Xian had become exemplary surpassers in the time that had passed since their coming to the third god's sanctuary. 1 year later, he finally managed to crack open the last gene lock of the Blood Pulse Sutra. When the 10th gene lock opened, it made his body far tougher. It wasn't particularly brilliant in any individual capacity, but it was good to have it finished. He didn't mind it being underwhelming for himself, as his desire for advancing the Blood Pulse Sutra had shifted in recent years. His focus with it, much like the members of Blood Legion, was to ensure his heirs would be stronger. It wasn't for himself, it was for the future generations of his lineage. And once that was done, he didn't have much else to do. He was going to become a demigod, but he was in no immediate rush to. He made sure to spend a lot more time with his mother, and with Ji Yanran after this. The fourth god's sanctuary, the world of demigods, was completely different than all else that had come before. Old Man Ji had told him it was just the beginning. Han Sen had received the bulk of what he knew about the fourth god's sanctuary from Old Man Ji himself. He wasn't going to underestimate the realm he would soon be stepping into. The fourth god's sanctuary was still a world of creatures and spirits, but they started very much like humans did there. They started from scratch. The shelters there were all individual and separate from one another. Each shelter had a demigod genocore, and to conquer a shelter, one had to claim the demigod genocore. After a human became a demigod, their own demigod genocore would increase in strength the more geno points they collected. Unfortunately for humans, they now also had to play by the rules spirits did. Demigod genocores generated different types of powers. He'd still be very vulnerable, stepping into that world. The demigod creatures that had genocores would be lethal for humans to try to do battle with. They came in all varieties, and if your attention lapsed, you could be killed by a genocore without even knowing how you died. Han Sen listened to Old Man Ji intently, but ultimately, how he'd start off was down to luck. Becoming a demigod was easy for humans. Even humans who maxed out their genes were susceptible to the fickle nature of fate. Unfortunately, luck still played a large role in their ascendance to the next sanctuary. But his success there would also subject him to the picky throes of luck when he came out the other side and spawned. But as long as he didn't wind up spawning next to a strong creature or spirit, he figured he'd be okay. As such, he made sure to spend as much time with Ji Yanran as possible. They went to a lot of places and experienced many new adventures together to forge lasting memories that would accompany Han Sen after he made the jump. He prepared himself for walking up the fabled stairway. After a fond farewell to his friends and companions, with whom he had accomplished much, it was time for him to go. And when it was, he took off towards the endless sea mostly alone. The spirits weren't aware that Han Sen was leaving, so they were going to remain in order and adhere to the contract. Han Sen brought the Silver Fox, Bower, Little Angel, and Golden Growler with him. While he was unsure at first, he also decided to bring Moment Queen. He would have liked to bring others with him, but they'd die if they could not withstand the searing flames of the steppes. Han Sen had decided to bring Moment Queen with him because he still had reservations regarding her goodwill towards humans. He still believed he had to keep the leash on her, to avoid her doing something evil once he was gone. The stronger Han Sen was, the stronger the fire would be, too. His companions were sure to have a hard time following him up. He didn't even plan to bring Bower or the Silver Fox with him at first, either. But they suspected what he was going to do, and nothing he did would remove them from his company. Han Sen thought if the Xian Min successor was able to bring a skeleton up with him, then he wouldn't have too much trouble bringing his super creature companions. Little Angel and Golden Growler were staples of Han Sen's collection. They had always been with him, and he wasn't going to leave them behind now. They had 10 gene locks open as well, anyway. Considering their abilities, even with sentimentality out of the picture, he really wanted to bring them with him. Han Sen gave out the rest of his beast souls to his mother and Ji Yanran, so they'd have a fair amount of decent gear and weaponry to get a head start in the third god's sanctuary. He also tasked Xie Qingqing and a few of the others with keeping an extra eye out for those two, to ensure nothing bad would befall them. With the underground shelter and the life geno-essences they had been gifted, though, it didn't seem likely they could be bullied. Blurg. Han Sen fell out onto the grass, coughing blood. Bauer was as cool as ever, and when she came out, she did so with a graceful drop on top of Han Sen's head, pushing his face into the bloodied soil. Han Sen was immediately starting to regret bringing Bauer, the Silver Fox, Little Angel, Golden Growler, and Moment Queen with him. He couldn't imagine what the pain was like for them, to brace and stay composed on their ascension through the fire. The fires Han Sen had to endure were of a greater intensity than what Xiang Yin and the Xian Min's successor had dealt with. The lecherous flames they suffered were far weaker, and despite Han Sen once fearing the steps those two had trodden, he now thought they had gotten off easy. And that aside, Han Sen had brought 5 people with him. This only boosted the intensity. He had felt as if the fires had been deliberately testing him in their wicked glow, like wretched demons taunting him to fail under the pressure of those he had selected to bring along. Fortunately for Han Sen, he was able to employ the powers of Super King Spirit Mode, Jade Skin, and the Dongxian Sutra to pull through. He'd have most certainly failed had he tried to mount the steps without those abilities to boost his resistances. On their way up, he started by trying his best to keep everyone calm, composed, and alive in the ascent. But there was little he could do when the true strength of the fire kicked in. It soon became clear to him that the only one he could truly protect and guide up was Bauer, and the others would have to succeed by themselves. Han Sen was able to keep Bauer shielded from most of the fire, but the flames had properly incinerated the Silver Fox. By the time he was through, he had become an egg. Little Angel and Golden Growler were in a similar position, now evolving. Han Sen was unable to protect Moment Queen at all on the way up, and while she had managed to become a demigod, the fires had taken a toll on her. She was grievously injured, and it seemed as if there'd be little she could do for a long time to come. It's fortunate I did not decide to bring anyone else. If I had, the fires would have surely killed me, Han Sen said to himself, feeling glad he had made it. Han Sen took a look around. After that, he was in a field, one that was as plain as could be. A single wide expanse with no notable geography or landmarks to consider. He picked himself up and exerted much strength to do so. He was incredibly heavy, and it didn't feel natural. The very air seemed to tingle and hum with energy, and the atmosphere around almost felt tangible. Even the gravity felt remarkably higher there. It was lucky his body was as strong as it was, and so it didn't inhibit him. Unfortunately, his clothes had been entirely scorched away by the fires. He was nude in the field, and although it was a touch awkward, he was at least relieved there was no one else around to see him that way. Han Sen, Super Body Super King Spirit, Ultimate. Level, Demigod. Lifespan, 500. Evolution requirements, none. Geno points, none. Demigod Geno cores, none. Han Sen did not know what the ultimate tag meant, but he was pleased that his lifespan had another 100 added on top, bringing the number up to 500. Han Sen already knew there would be no more evolution requirements before coming to the fourth god's sanctuary. Even in the Alliance, there were no further evolution pools. It didn't seem to matter much where you went after this, even if your Geno points were at the max. Han Sen caught sight of some odd shrubbery nearby. The bushes had thick leaves, and not wanting to remain naked, he brought Bauer over to help him make some clothes. After crafting some makeshift clothing, he suddenly heard the chittering of an insect. It was a grasshopper, and it was making a squealing sound down in the grass. Han Sen gave it a scan and noticed its life force to be obscenely weak. It didn't look like a demigod in the least, and although it initially gave the impression it was just a common insect, it kept on squealing. As if to taunt Han Senator, he decided he was going to kill it with Ghost Slash and nab himself a few early Geno points. But before he could attack, he felt a pain come onto his right eye. Han Sen moved his hands to cup the afflicted eye, but then another sharp pain began to pierce his left one. Han Sen swiftly started to look around and scan the surrounding vicinity for something else that might have been attacking him, but he could not see anything. The absence of danger he could visualize was strange, but his gut was most assuredly telling him something was wrong. The grasshopper then scrambled away, disappearing someplace in the grass. Han Sen could no longer feel its presence, but eyes still felt as if they were in pain. So, Han Sen used Dongxian aura to search, but strangely, he could not make out anything. Arg! An agonizing pain suddenly pierced Han Sen's throat, but shortly after, it spread to his stomach. A cold sweat began to roll down his face, which was now twisting under the agony he was suffering. Han Sen decided to use jade skin, which gave him that crystallized luster. Following its use, even all his organs were turned to shimmering crystal. Han Sen could still feel the stabbing, but at least jade skin was enough to deny him the full experience of that pain. Han Sen then sought to examine himself with the Tenjin locks of the Dongxian Sutra open. After examining himself, Han Sen was able to notice the presence of something small and unnatural residing in his stomach. It was a gray silkworm, of sorts. If he did not have Dongxian aura, he would have assuredly not been able to find it. The head of the silkworm was very much like a needle, and it was undoubtedly the source of the pain Han Sen was experiencing. After more examination, Han Sen discovered it was not a creature, though. Instead, it was the grasshopper's demigod Geno core. From this bug, Han Sen was able to detect and learn the sequential structure of the grasshopper. The grasshopper came out of hiding once more, and it peered at Han Sen through the blades of grass. Not wanting to risk a single thing, Han Sen knew he'd have to kill it the first opportunity he had. He immediately cast Ghost Slash towards it. The grasshopper was cut in half. When it was, the bug inside Han Sen's stomach died with it. Ordinary creature Soil Lotus killed.
No Beast Soul Gun.
Bronze Geno core received. Dust bug. Consume its flesh to gain 0 to 10 ordinary Geno points randomly. Han Sen placed the dust bug on his finger. The Geno core was so small, he needed the Dongxian aura just to see it. Dust bug. Earth element bronze Geno core. Making effective use of this Geno core would require a certain level of proficiency with the element of Earth. Bronze was the tier of this Geno core. There were 4 ranks of Geno cores in total: bronze, silver, gold, and gemstone. People occasionally whispered the rumor of there being a Geno core that superseded even the extremely rare and exotic gemstone quality Geno core. The details of what it might have been were scant, but the rumors never died. And if the mystical cores did exist, it was believed no human had possession of one. Han Sen had many Earth element Geno points, so he could use his Dongxian Sutra to make use of the dust bug. However, this was not Han Sen's Geno core. It belonged to a creature that had been slain, and now it was forever locked in its current state. There was no room for its power to grow. If Han Sen had a Geno core he could actually call his own, its strength and power would grow in accordance with his own body. Han Sen tried controlling the bug, and he quickly understood how it had hurt him earlier. The dust bug was so small, it'd undoubtedly slide beneath the notice of almost everyone. It could easily cut its way through the body of a creature or person without drawing attention to itself. Han Sen was also starting to understand why old Manji had told him not to underestimate a single creature he'd encounter. The grasshopper was only an ordinary class creature, and yet it had dished out that much damage. What's more, it had made its own life force appear even less than it was. He knew he'd have to be careful, and danger could find him at any moment. With things being this way, he understood why the survival rate for humans in the Fourth God Sanctuary was so low. It was no wonder that only 100 humans were currently surviving in the Fourth God Sanctuary and making a living which would allow them to go to and fro from the Alliance. Most people who made it to the Fourth God Sanctuary didn't seem to live long enough to make it home. There was always the possibility that there were many humans living in the Fourth God Sanctuary who were just unable to find a way to return home. But even so, it seemed impossible for there to be many in such circumstances. Attempting to return to the Alliance from the Fourth God Sanctuary required the same thing as in previous sanctuaries. They would have to either conquer a shelter or find one that was uninhabited. Of course, doing that was far more difficult in this realm than it now was in the others. There was a sickeningly low number of shelters that were owned by humans in the Fourth God Sanctuary. Their numbers were few, and the chance of finding them was extremely small. Han Sen wasn't concerned with securing passage home just yet, though. He scanned the surrounding vicinity and told himself to collect 100 ordinary Geno points, first and foremost. He wanted to get a Geno core he could call his own. He had learned from his discussions with Old Manji that if he managed to collect 100 Geno points, his body and power would generate one for him. So, aside from the increase in strength, there was a tangible bonus that now prompted his urge to hurry in the collection of 100 ordinary Geno points. He also wanted to do things in the proper established order. Han Sen didn't want to skip around and try to take shortcuts like the ones that had benefited him greatly in his early days in the Third God's Sanctuary. It was too risky to do that in this place, so all he wanted to do now was knuckle down and knock out as many ordinary creatures as he could find, one by one. It was not unheard of for many supremely talented creatures and spirits to receive a Geno core right off the bat, following their traversal of the 10 steps of the Holy Door. Han Sen had hoped he'd be considered talented enough to receive one, but he was mildly irked when he emerged in the Fourth God's Sanctuary with empty hands and just a face full of dirt. But at least he had managed to slay the soil lotus and earn himself the dust bug fairly quickly. He didn't bring the cruel bottle, just in case it was destroyed in his ascendance. Either that, or it had become the cruel sand. Han Sen looked at the body of the soil lotus and licked his lips. A grasshopper wasn't the most appetizing creature, but it was his first kill in the Fourth God's Sanctuary. He made a fire, cooked it, and ate it. It didn't taste too bad. Soil lotus has been consumed. Ordinary gene +1. Han Sen heard the announcement play a number of times. He tried sharing some with Bauer, but she didn't want it. Han Sen ate the entire thing himself and walked away with 8 ordinary Geno points. Not too shabby for his first meal. Ordinary Geno points seemed to have a much greater effect in the realm of demigods, it seemed. Already, he felt himself becoming much stronger. I need to find a safe place I can hunker down in. Out here, in plain sight, it's too dangerous for me. Then Han Sen took off in a direction, hoping to find someplace he could use as a den. For the duration of his travel, he tirelessly scanned the environment all around him. He didn't want to risk another chance encounter with a grasshopper like the last, or even worse. And for a long time, he didn't see anything. Whether that was luck or the field was just a quiet place in general, he did not know. But when he ascended a hill and got to the top for a clearer view, there still wasn't much he could see. Plain, verdant expanses, as far as his eyes could see. He could have flown to go at a faster pace, but Han Sen didn't fancy doing that. It was too risky, and there was a high chance he could be spotted. Until he was familiar with the region, stealth would be his main mode of travel. After an intense, continued scan, though, Han Sen finally caught sight of something. It was approaching. He threw himself into the grass to hide, and then he focused his vision on what he had seen. At first he felt relief. It was a sheep, one that was as fluffy and as cute as the most darling sketch could bring alive. It had 2 black, twirling horns, and it was a plump little thing. It looked adorable, actually. And it looked docile, too. It didn't appear to be aggressive. Of course, having learned his lesson, Han Sen wasn't willing to underestimate the creature. Its cute appearance could merely be a mask of deceit. "Hey you, what are you doing down in the grass?" The mouth of the sheep moved, and it seemed to actually speak. Han Sen looked around him, thinking it had been a coincidence. He thought maybe someone had approached and was talking to him, but he could see no one. The sheep really did seem to be talking. "What are you looking at, bub?" "I'm talking to you." The sheep's eyes rolled, indicating it was annoyed by Han Sen's lack of response. "I was just, resting," Han Sen sputtered, as he dragged himself back onto his feet, patting away the soil and blades of grass that still clung to him. The sheep seemed to smirk, and then it said, "What are you?" "Actually, you know what? I don't care. Just tell me the powers you possess. If I think you'd make a valuable asset to my herd, you can come and graze with us, bub." Han Sen's face twitched in shock, unsure if this was some strange dream he was experiencing or not. People had told him that the creatures in the Fourth God's Sanctuary were crazy, but he didn't think they would be this flavor of crazy. "I have a lot of different powers," Han Sen started by saying. Associating himself with a sheep would be strange, But this was a chance for Han Sen to be part of a crowd, he believed. Strength in numbers was a legitimate concept. After all, if he could become an ally of the sheep, the current dangerous circumstances might not be so grave for Han Sen. The sheep seemed peeved by the vague response he had received, though. Han Sen caught this, and he wanted to fix the mood between them. So, he boldly proclaimed, "I can destroy stuff." With the Tenjin locks of the Dongxian Sutra firing on all cylinders, it wasn't exactly a lie. The sheep grimaced, and with disappointment slumping its limbs, it turned to leave. "Don't go yet. Talk to me." Han Sen wanted to learn what the sheep had expected of him. A weak *SS creature like you probably doesn't even have a Geno core. "I need someone special, bub. I need someone who can heal or support others. Finding a random creature that can take pleasure in destroying stuff is easy, and I can assuredly find one stronger than a scrawny kid like you, bub." The sheep then ran off. Han Sen was confused by this, and so he turned his head to ask Bauer, "Did I just get insulted by a sheep?" "Yes, Dad. I told you to eat more," Bauer said. Han Sen could hardly believe he had been condescended to by a sheep. Han Sen could tell it was an ordinary creature, but he could also tell it was as good as an ordinary creature could get. "Brother sheep, don't go. I was wrong. I'm good at healing," Han Sen yelled, going after the woolly mammal. It was rare to find herbivore creatures, so Han Sen didn't want to miss the opportunity to follow the sheep if the rest of its herd were of the same kind. He'd have the benefit of being in a herd, and he wouldn't have to share the corpses of creatures they slew. "You can heal, bub?" the sheep asked, turning around to see Han Sen panting in the chase. The powers of healing were rare, and the sheep did not like Han Senator. It never expected him to possess the powers of healing, and the sheep had only said what it said to hurry the dialogue along so it could leave. "Yeah, where I come from, they call me Dr. Sexy." Han Sen puffed up his chest and danced his pecs. The sheep did not believe Han Senator suddenly. One of its horns departed the seat against its head and went twirling towards a nearby bush. A squeal sounded from the undergrowth, as a rat had unwittingly found itself impaled. The rat struggled to get itself free, and when Han Sen went to take a look, he saw that the rat was actually being held in place by a scimitar. Han Sen was surprised. The black steel scimitar must have been the sheep's Geno core. "Okay, Dr. Sexy, show me what you can do." The sheep gestured towards the rat that seemed to be dying. Han Sen then knelt down beside it and started the healing process that he had learned from the Holy Rhino. Perhaps it was because he was in the fourth god's sanctuary, but it took an uncomfortably long time to heal the creature. "Well, I can't lie. You really can heal, but whiskey, tango, foxtrot. Why is it so slow?" "Ugh, it's fine for now. Come on, bub," the sheep said. Han Sen followed after the sheep and came to a forest with many creatures in its eaves. Han Sen saw a big black bird staring at him with pinprick eyes that almost burned holes in him. There were 4 creatures with 6 legs that had to be as big as tanks. And on the left, there was a spirit sitting against a tree. In front of Han Sen, there was a beast that seemed to half resemble a boar. Its rear was just a mangled mesh of bones, though. The creature was mainly black, but its eyes were red, like bright rubies embedded in coal. It was as big as a train compartment, all in all. If he had to guess, he'd go out on a limb and assume that fearsome beast was the leader of the motley crew. "It looks like meat's back on the menu, boys," the spirit shouted, eyeing Han Sen like he was food. The sheep did not answer the spirit and merely spoke to the boar. "This is the man you've been looking for. He doesn't even have a Geno core. What's the point?" that same spirit said rudely. The boar looked at the sheep, and the sheep quickly said, "He's weak now, but he can heal you. He will only improve and become stronger." The beast looked at Han Sen and groaned. The noise he made was hefty, and Han Sen could imagine the power it possessed even from that. "Hurry up and heal him, bub," the sheep said. Han Sen then noticed a wound on the boar's chest that was bleeding profusely. Wanting to impress and not disappoint, Han Sen hurriedly simulated the powers of the Holy Rhino. He got to healing the mighty beast, but his performance was even worse this time around. The process was slower than it had been for the rat. Han Sen guessed it was because of how powerful the creature was. He imagined it had to be primitive class, at the very least. The spirit started laughing until he was out of breath. When he found composure, he wheezed out, "Pa, you call that healing?" "Ha ha." The sheep blushed and told the spirit, "Any healing is better than no healing." The beast Han Sen was healing did not say or do anything. He ignored their bickering and just focused on accepting the healing and trying to rest. The healing process was going to take a while, and Han Sen was able to have a home amongst the collective. All he had to do for them, each and every day, was tend to the wounds of the boar. Although Han Sen was not interested in being a healer, he was able to learn a lot by residing amongst them. Han Sen learned a lot from the sheep in his time with them. He was in a portion of land called Jade Hill. It was a relatively tame location, and it was free from the presence of strong creatures. In fact, the posse Han Sen had joined up with was the biggest there. The sheep and the six-legged beasts were ordinary creatures. The spirit was only squire class. Han Sen thought it best to stick with them, but on the second day of his time with them, the boar he had been healing went off to drink water and never returned. When they went out looking for him, all they found were its bones. Its blood had dyed the entire waterhole red, and when Han Sen saw it, his face turned a ghastly shade of gray. He thought he might get the blame, but this didn't appear likely, for when the rest found the boar's remains, they all just ran off in fear. With the black beast having been killed by something, they did not dare remain where they were. Whatever had killed it had to be extremely fearsome. Han Sen ran alongside the sheep, thinking it best to stay close. The sheep ran as fast as it could and traversed a great distance. It no longer needed Han Sen's company, so it wasn't going to wait around for him. But much to his surprise, Han Sen was able to keep up. The sheep said to him, "The boss is dead. Do you still want to follow me, bub?" "Sure. Where are we going?" Han Sen did not mind going with the sheep, since he seemed to know the land a lot more. He'd be a powerful ally. "We're going to find another boss, bub." The sheep continued sprinting for a little while, before turning its head to Han Sen and saying, "Don't worry. You'll be safe with me." The sheep brought Han Sen to a little hill, and there they followed behind a primitive creature. The creature was a green snake, and the sheep told Han Sen it was stronger than the black boar they had previously been following. The sheep talked their way into becoming members of the group, and they were both accepted into the fold fairly easily. But that same night, the snake had its head lopped off. When they woke up the next morning, only its head remained. They hadn't a clue where its body had been taken. After the snake was killed, all the creatures began running off again. Han Sen sought to stick with the sheep, and the sheep was accepting. The sheep told Han Sen that things would be okay, for he knew another powerful creature whose team they could be a part of. Han Sen, still wanting to know more, followed after the sheep. In regards to what happened next, Han Sen felt a little strange. What was going on had to be far more than a mere coincidence. That next boss was killed, and over the next 10 days, they ended up in the service of at least 6 different bosses. Each boss was killed within 3 days of the pair coming into their employ. Who keeps killing these bosses? What could they possibly want? Is this Phantom Menace coming after me? Han Sen wondered. It had happened far too many times for it to remain chalked up as a coincidence. Whoever he and the sheep decided to follow would die. Every time they joined up with a new creature, it seemed like they were handing out a death sentence. But the lands about did not have humans, and if someone wanted Han Sen dead, it made the most sense for that enemy to be a human. And if they wanted to kill Han Sen, why would they go after the creature first? If this enemy could kill the creature they followed with that much ease, then that same enemy could kill Han Sen with even less trouble. Are we really that unlucky? Han Sen asked himself, longing for normalcy and steadiness with some hardy company. Even the sheep was starting to become depressed. Fortunately, news did not travel and the creatures did not gossip. Han Sen and the sheep would be branded the boss busters if word got out that they carried this awful death sentence around with them. The sheep rested for half a day and eventually said to Han Sen, "There is one last primitive boss we can consult, bub. Hopefully, his health and his head will fare better. Let's go to him and see if we can find some stability." "Sure," Han Sen said. Han Sen had followed the sheep for quite a while now, and he had come to know the area quite well. If the two did have to go their separate ways, Han Sen thought he'd survive just fine on his own. Han Sen also thought the two could just go off and make good by themselves, but the sheep was true to its calling. It really wanted to follow others, and since there was only one boss left to see, Han Sen thought he might as well accompany it. But Han Sen was growing more and more concerned over the constant slaying of primitive bosses. He didn't want this queer enemy coming for him, too. The boss they met next was a monster with 3 horns protruding from its head. The horns were large and gnarly, disfigured like tree branches that had endured far too many winters. As for its body, it was not too dissimilar to that of a cow. The sheep was a smooth talker, and again, they were accepted into the service of the horny cow. The sheep was worried this boss would end up as a hunk of chuck roast, just as the rest had. That same night, he mumbled to himself repeatedly, saying, "Please don't die. Please don't die. Please don't die, bub. Please don't die. Please don't die. Please don't die, bub." Han Sen was worried too, but he had come to like the sheep. It was quite humorous to watch. The creatures that followed the 3-horned beast weren't particularly special, and they were actually the same type of creature that the big cheese was. They were all horned cows. Han Sen thought it was slightly strange that only he and the sheep were different from the rest. The sheep had to be the slickest talker he had ever met, and his social skills were off the charts. Han Sen couldn't imagine trying to talk his way into being happily accepted into a crowd such as that. And while Han Sen hadn't earned anything from his time with the sheep, he had instead learned. He had come to know quite a bit. This group was more tight-knit than the others, and they stayed much closer together than the other groups. Han Sen himself was only 30 meters away from the boss, and since he had a clear line of sight on the boss, Han Sen thought it would be best to watch him with Dongxian aura. If an enemy approached, his focus would reveal the enemy that had hounded them. It can't be just bad luck, can it? Han Sen half-asked himself once more. At midnight, Han Sen detected strange movement nearby their leader. A second later, the creature's head was hewn off. Fortunately, Han Sen was able to see who had done the deed. And when he saw who the murderer was, he was surprised to see it was someone he was quite familiar with. It was nighttime, but the glade was brightly lit beneath the gracious glow of the moon. Han Sen witnessed the slayer of the 3-horned beast, and he noted how familiar its killer looked. No way. Han Sen saw it was a woman with dragon-scaled skin, draconic horns, and wings. She was wielding a cleaver. Before Han Sen became a demigod, he had eaten the food she had prepared for him each and every day. She looked exactly like the spirit chef the Serpent Throne had been mimicking. While Serpent Throne had generated a sentient doll in her image, this was the real one. This was her, live and in the flesh. After she lopped the beast's head off, she picked up the creature's carcass and went on her way. She was the size of an average human, but she was able to carry the entire lifeless body of a beast that had to be at least 3 times her own size with great ease. She went away at a brisk pace, too, and when the gathering of lesser creatures saw the head of their leader oozing blood into the soil, they started freaking out and running away. The sheep woke up, roused from its deep slumber by all the commotion, and when its eyes fell across the bloody head, just like the rest, it wanted to spring back to its feet and race off. But Han Sen grabbed the sheep by its tail to stop it. Unfortunately, it paid no heed and simply kept on going. Han Sen was unable to hold onto his tail due to the speed he was going, and the sheep kept crying out as he went, "I'm going to die, bub. I'm going to die." Although he had grown fond of the fluffy thing, Han Sen couldn't be bothered with tracking it down. Instead, he was keener on examining the severed head. Now that he knew what was killing the primitive creatures of the land, he didn't feel the need to run off. With his prior connection to the spirit, he didn't fear her so much that he'd flee the area like the rest. The chef was able to slay primitive creatures with ease, and knowing that, it was obvious she wasn't going to waste time hunting down ordinary creatures he was equivalent to, anyway. Han Sen imagined an analogy, appropriate for the chef that she was. In his mind, he compared her to a world-class chef who was proficient at preparing the greatest cuisine that a most magnificent restaurant could offer. To settle for ordinary creatures would be reducing herself to being the dishwasher. Han Sen would be another wretched plate to clean, in her eyes. And the less she had to clean, the better. As such, He believed himself to be safe staying in the vicinity if he didn't bother her. Han Sen examined the cow-like head and lifted it up. He was going to cook what little of it he could, in the hopes of earning a couple of primitive Geno points. And as much as he would have liked to go after the chef, he felt he didn't need to just yet. That wasn't on his agenda, for the time being. And even though he once had the chef for a doll, that wouldn't guarantee the real spirit would be friendly to him. After what he had witnessed with Three-Eyed Demon, Han Sen would prefer keeping his distance for a little while, in case he found himself getting grilled and carved like a turkey. Seeing how she one-hit killed the three-horned beast, Han Sen knew he had no chance of fighting her. If he approached her, and she wasn't friendly to him or Bauer, their chances of survival were pretty slim. Picking up the head, Han Sen fancied starting a fire so he could cook it. The entire time he was following the sheep, all he was able to eat were plants. Fed up of pulling grass out of his teeth, Han Sen was on cloud 9 at the prospect of sinking his teeth into delicious meat again. He was familiar with the area now, too. He and Bauer went into a nearby forest with the head, and he cleaned and prepared the head with his water abilities. The cow's head was ridiculously juicy, and the aroma of its sizzling made their bellies groan with hunger. Of course, the last thing Han Sen wanted was to draw the attention and ire of other hungry mouths that might be lurking in the area, so he made sure to mask the smell so they could remain hidden. Bauer was drooling at the sight of the succulent meat, and she chewed on the air with a restless mouth, in ardent anticipation of the meal that awaited her. "Can I eat yet?" Bauer couldn't help but ask. Han Sen did not have any spices with him, and if the meat was still raw, it wouldn't go down like the treat he wanted it to be. So, he told her, "It's almost done. You need to learn some manners. Don't look like you've come down with a fever while you're waiting for food. It's not like this is the first time you've eaten some of Daddy Cool's cooking." Bauer does have manners. Yep. See? Bauer sat up straight then, wanting to give the illusion she was a grown-up woman with some semblance of elegance. But when the scent of the meat tickled her nostrils once more, she practically started drooling. As if possessed by a ghost, she began leaning towards the meat. Han Sen couldn't blame her, though. He himself was staring at the meat like a starved, angry wolf. Before it was fully cooked, Han Sen began to carve a few cooked slices of meat off the head. Then, he hastily served them to Bauer and himself. "Dad, this is good," Bauer exclaimed, as they both gorged on the delicious meat like pigs. It was like a Turkish grill. The head had quite a bit of meat on it, more than Han Sen expected. But still, the pair was hungry for more. Bauer was so hungry, she sucked on all the meat-stripped bones she could. Bauer ended up eating the most, and disappointingly, Han Sen didn't receive any primitive Geno points. It wasn't surprising, though, given it was only the beast's head. That's not to say nothing of worth was earned. The three horns had resisted the fire for the entire duration of being cooked. They looked like they'd make useful tools or weapons. With jade skin, Han Sen poked the horns and noted how sturdy they still felt. They looked like they'd make for hardy tools indeed. Since Han Sen was practically naked in the fourth god's sanctuary, he settled on using them as weapons for the time being. The horns were hard, but if Han Sen used the Dongshin Sutra to remove them from the head, they'd surely break. So, Han Sen settled on using jade skin to dig them out completely. The skull was cone-shaped, and the parts he broke off looked to make a fine handle and handguards. The way the horns were shaped and serrated, they looked as if they'd make good sword breakers. And since they were lethally sharp, they'd make decent spears, too. And it was at that moment, Han Sen suddenly felt something approach. He turned around and there she was, the chef, cleaver in hand. She was a mere 10 meters away. Han Sen, upon seeing the chef, thought to himself, has she returned for the head? But she'd have to dig into our stomachs if she wanted it back, and that would be no trouble for her. "Oh, the head? We thought you had no need for it, so we ate it." Han Sen began stepping back, bringing Bauer firmly back into his arms. Han Sen knew how strong she was through the Serpent Throne's replication of her, but this was the genuine her. This was her as a demigod now, too. If he could, Han Sen wanted to avoid a fight. Immediately, he took off running. He knew she enjoyed feeding the entity Dragon Eater, and not wanting to take a chance of getting spit roasted for a midnight snack, he thought it best to scram. Han Sen had a fitness level of 7,500. If he wanted to rival primitive creatures in strength, he'd have to get that figure up to 10,000. With her being able to topple mighty primitive creatures in one swing, though, three-horned Beast King included, he'd need to be even higher. Fighting her was the last thing Han Sen wanted to do. The Dongxian Sutra allowed Han Sen to see through the entire world, but he didn't think it would give him much of an edge against an opponent who was that strong. The gulf of power that separated the two was too wide. Han Sen did not yet have a Geno core either. He was able to guess she probably had one, but its exact nature was a mystery. Making use of his Phoenix techniques, Han Sen committed to the act of flight. Surprisingly, the chef was unable to keep up with him. She was strong, but evidently sluggish when it came to agility. Just like any other primitive creature, she could not keep up with Han Sen. Han Sen thought to himself, did she just become a demigod? The man that was dead slumped against the entrance to the underground shelter. If he was there during her reign, then she couldn't have been in the fourth god's sanctuary for longer than 100 years. Perhaps she has been unlucky all this time and has been unable to gain strength. Han Sen's deduction was not too far from the truth. When she first came to the fourth god's sanctuary, she was placed in a very dangerous area where she could not do much, and she had been trapped. When the time came to escape, she barely made it out alive, and only in the past 2 years had she been able to start getting stronger. Han Sen kept on running until he stumbled across a thick bundle of wool on the ground. It was the sheep's butt. The sheep spun around with a mushroom in its mouth and said, "Hey, I've been looking for you, bub. I thought you were dead. Come dine on this. I've even flavored it with soil for you. Once you've chowed down, we'll go see another boss. He's a good distance away, but he should be strong." But Han Sen had been running like the wind, and he currently had no time to discuss anything. He simply ended up yelling, "Run!" If the sheep was unfortunate enough to remain, and was later claimed by the chef, he'd become a well-grilled hunk of mutton in no time. When the sheep saw what was tailing Han Sen, though, the solace of the shrooms quickly evaporated, and in absolute horror, he froze. "Come on, man. Run. Move." Han Sen yelled at the sheep, seeing it refuse to budge. Suddenly, the sheep began to kowtow, and it pleaded, "Please, spare my life. Spare me, and I will become a servant. I will do everything you command me to. I will live for you, and you alone." Seeing the sheep beg like that, Han Sen couldn't help but freeze, too. But Han Sen didn't think begging from the dirt would do him much good. He wagered the sheep would still end up cooked, forked, and eaten, one way or another. He ended up being mistaken, though. It had slipped Han Sen's mind that the sheep was a silver-tongued cretin that could talk his way out of a paper bag. "Stop him. Fear not, milady. I will not let him get away." The sheep leaped before Han Sen and launched one of his boomerang-like horns towards his friend-turned-target. This sheep will do anything to survive. Where'd his faith and morals get off to? Han Sen struggled to believe the sheep was more obscene than himself, but alas, it was true. This was a betrayal, as cut and dry as one could get. Seeing the sheep's horn heading his way, Han Sen brought out one of his own horns to try to deflect it away from him. But despite using a pinpoint-precise ghost slash on the incoming projectile, it was not enough to break it and quell its violent approach. The impact knocked the flying horn away, but it was like a heat-seeking missile, and it rebounded mid-air to retarget Han Sen and resume its deadly approach. D***MN. That thing is like a homing rocket. Han Sen pulled out a second horn, planning to use Yin-Yang Blast to destroy the sheep horn. He knew he had underestimated the power of the sheep's Geno core, but he had only seen it in action once before. And things only got worse when Han Sen tried to use Yin-Yang Blast to take it down. The projectile absorbed his Yin power to propel itself towards him at an even greater speed. Han Sen had slowed down considerably to deal with the sheepish traitor. It had given the chef the time necessary to catch up, and now that she was in range, she pulled out her fork of doom. She lobbed it at Han Sen. Han Sen managed to evade the fork, but another sound filled his ears. With a pang, a crystal bowl had trapped him. "Boss lady, it is done." The sheep was now like a dog, groveling obediently. The chef ignored him completely, though. Instead, She approached the bowl that domed the area around Han Sen. It's time to bring out the big guns. She's just asking for a super spank. Han Sen gathered up a blistering orb of Dongxian sutra-fueled power in his right hand. The chef approached Han Sen with her cleaver in hand. Just as Han Sen was about to retaliate with super spank, he heard a chilly voice boom from the skies. Did you kill the primitive creatures? The chef stopped and looked up into the sky. Han Sen lowered his hand and also looked up at the phantom figure that was now addressing them. When his vision cleared, he could see a male spirit hovering high up in the air. His eyes were fixed on the chef, and his face bore an expression of distaste. Han Sen thought to himself, "Poor you, bub. You pledged allegiance to the chef, and now she's going to get her asterisks handed to her. You chose the wrong side, pal." "Who are you?" the chef asked the spirit. "You killed my creatures, you horrid hag. And you roam these lands without knowing who I am? I am the leader of Jade Hill. These lands you tread belong to me." The spirit paused briefly. He continued to address the chef, his words simmering with restrained anger. "You killed my creatures, and that means there's a price to pay. You will cough up." The spirit summoned a book in his hands. It was a book that was adorned with a number of strange scrawlings, symbols, and patterns. He opened the copper-like cover and began to draw with his fingertip. Due to Han Sen being trapped beneath the bowl, he was unable to see exactly what the spirit was drawing. Beneath the glass encasing, he could not make use of his Dongxian aura. A second later, though, he was done. And with a blinding font of light, a beast came out of the book. It was a 3-meter-long creature that had emerged from the page of that book. It cried out and then flew down towards the chef. The spirit looked far stronger than the 3-horned beast king the chef had slain earlier, so there was every chance she had met her match here. The chef frowned and threw up her left fist, and from out of nowhere, a fork appeared in her hand. Each prong pierced through the meaty hide, flesh, and body of the beast that was bearing down on her. With the creature stuck firmly in place upon her frightening utensil, the chef began to swing her cleaver at the beast with her one free arm. The beast, however, despite being lodged firmly upon her fork, did not seem to feel any pain. It still tried to attack the chef, flailing helplessly, but it could not reach her. The chef continued to swing and swing, slicing up the spirit's newly spawned creature like a giant sushi roll. "You are good, but you are also dead." The self-proclaimed boss of Jade Hill spoke calmly, but his tone was heavy with serious gravitas. The boss of Jade Hill returned to his book and began conjuring something else. The chef, disposing of the mutilated creature on her fork, raised her kitchen utensils once more. She was ready to fight and destroy anything that dared come close. When the next creature was summoned, she destroyed it. And this was how it went for some time. Creature after creature was thrown at her, and before long, she could not keep up with the pace at which these creatures were summoned. The sheep, having seen this, began running away like a hare on fire. Han Sen was shocked at the spectacle, and he knew he was in for a lot more surprises in the fourth god's sanctuary. This spirit's Geno core was obviously a book, and he wondered what others might possess. It also made him more eager to find out which Geno core he would receive once he got one, and it spurred him with an even greater desire to max out his ordinary Geno points as soon as possible. The chef isn't looking too good. He's drawing way faster than she can exterminate. It's a little cheap of this boss leader guy, if I'm to be honest, Han Sen thought to himself. In the fourth god's sanctuary, if a spirit was unable to take down a shelter, they'd be unable to respawn. If the chef did not already have a shelter to call her own, she was in danger of being vanquished completely. She was in danger of death, an absolute one. Knowing she could not keep up with the pace of monster spawns, she tried a different tactic. She leaped up into the skies to get up close and personal with the boss of Jade Hill. The boss conjured a bird and stood upon it as the chef approached. And then the bird began to retreat, further and further away as the boss of Jade Hill stuck to his cheap tricks of summoning creatures to attack the chef who was now doing her best to get him. The chef had battled her way through legions of creatures, and there were surely far more to come. She was in a bad spot, and the chances of her actually getting close enough to defeat the boss were looking slim. I don't think she's going to make it. It's a shame, but but I suppose now is the best opportunity one have to get away. Han Sen, watching the corpses of slain creatures rain from the sky, tried punching his way through the crystal bowl to escape. Unfortunately, despite using jade skin to punch with all his might, there was not even a single crack rendered upon his cage's surface. Why is this bowl so hard? Is it a Geno core, perhaps?
Han Sen venture dogus.
Han Sen was going to try breaking through the bowl with Super Spank next, but then, the bowl suddenly flew back up towards the chef. Now that Han Sen was free, he wasn't going to question the blessing. He took off running as fast as he could. Killing a spirit would not provide him with a benefit, after all. He ran in the opposite direction that the sheep had fled, knowing it was best for him to avoid the traitorous fiend. And as he left, he could hear cries, roars, and the general sounds of a fierce battle high in the sky behind him. That's not to say he cared much for the trouble he was leaving behind. He was just happy to get away. Han Sen needed a Geno core more than anything, right now. Everyone appeared to use a Geno core to fight, so that put him at a grave disadvantage. Han Sen didn't think it was very fair. Because he had come to learn of this region well, Han Sen took off in the direction of a large mountain. A primitive toxic tooth used to live there, but it had been killed by the chef shortly after Han Sen and the sheep joined its employ. At least now the area was clear. The valley he traversed was home to creatures named jade snails. They were slow and weak, but their Geno cores and beast souls were good. Wanting to level up and increase his strength, Han Sen fancied taking a bunch of them down. There were a dozen jade snails occupying the valley, but because they were all so slow, they weren't going to be much of a threat at all. Their Geno cores were the shells upon their backs. Although they could not be used to harm Han Sen, they offered the snail an incredibly high level of defense. Even primitive creatures would have a difficult time breaking those shells open. Han Sen planned to snatch one of their shells and live inside it. That would be much better and safer than if he were to use a tent. Han Sen wanted the snail beast souls the most, though. The sheep had told him they were an armor type. Han Sen and Bauer were still dressed in leaves like cavemen. Obtaining one of those beast souls would be extremely beneficial. Han Sen noticed a few of the giant snails moving about near the gentle stream that flowed through the valley, and he thought that they looked like a bunch of houses on the move. The shells were white, which added to the illusion and looked fairly pretty, too. Han Sen approached one of them, which prompted the creature to retreat inside its shell. Han Sen was targeting them because of their docile, non-aggressive nature. It was a shame he had to pick on such gentle creatures, but given the circumstances, he didn't have much of a choice. The one bad thing about the snails, though, were the toxins they unleashed. They were slow, yes, but the sticky trail they left behind was wretchedly poisonous. If another creature consumed the sticky secretions, it wouldn't be long before the toxins ravaged their body and they'd die. If this happened, the snails would then go and eat the fallen creature. Han Sen knew about all this, as it was information given to him by the sheep. And not wanting to waste any time, Han Sen swept toward the snail and unleashed a powerful ghost slash at it. A big metal sound rang across the length of the valley, and unluckily for Han Sen, his brazen swipe had not even left a single scratch mark upon the shell of the snail. Ghost slash could teleport and befuddle opponents, but this trick did not increase its damage output, and there'd be nothing he could do to improve it on the fly. Han Sen wasn't going to use his fists to strike the shell, either, because it was poisonous. So, Han Sen drew out his horns and tried striking the shell with jade skin activated. And because the horns were like spears, Han Sen decided to use a skill he hadn't used in a long time. He employed the use of drillhead to try to drill into the snail's fortification. It was a successful approach. A plume of white dust erupted from where Han Sen started drilling into the shell, and he managed to lodge his horn a fair way inside. The snail had clearly felt it too, for it cried out in pain. Then it began trying to roll away while it was still inside the shell. Han Sen leaped away just in case, and then flipped over to the other side of the snail. Taking aim, he began drilling through the other side before it completely escaped him. The other snails in the area had taken notice of what was going on by now. Some began to sloppily wiggle their way over to support their brother against the human aggressor, while others tucked into their shells and rolled over. But thankfully, Han Sen was far faster and quite a bit stronger than the jade snails. The Geno cores couldn't protect the snails from Han Sen, so that pretty much rendered them hopeless against him. Han Sen eventually killed the snail he had started on, but right after it died, the shell shattered into bits. Ordinary creature jade snail killed.
No beast soul gun.
Geno core destroyed. Consume its flesh to gain 0 to 10 ordinary Geno points randomly. Even if Han Sen was able to kill those snails, their shells seemed likely to break. Maybe I'll just keep going to nab 2 beast souls instead, then. We can't stay naked any longer, Han Sen said to himself, before targeting another snail. When he approached it, though, he stopped. Then, he thought of something else. This ingenious idea prompted him to leave the valley. After a period of waiting, hidden just outside the border of the valley, all the snails eventually relaxed. They all came back out of their shells to move towards the fallen snail and eat it. Without any more time to waste, Han Sen summoned something. Han Sen summoned the bronze Geno core dust bug. Watching the snails eat, Han Sen figured he could fill the dust bug with the element of earth for a hearty stealth attack. Once he had prepped it for use, the dust bug took off flying towards the slimy things. It flew fairly slow, but there was nothing Han Sen could do about that. It was a small and hard thing, and it had a lot of cons. That was to be expected, though. After all, it was only a bronze-class Geno core. But Han Sen thought the few positives about the dust bug were all he needed. He could make do with the negatives, since he was only fighting near harmless snails. The snails did not have the Dongxian aura, either. With dull senses, they could not detect the dust bug slowly flying towards them. Eventually, the bug touched down near a snail and hopped onto one of their gooey bodies. The snail quickly retreated into its shell, feeling something foreign suddenly touch it. But it was too late, for the dust bug had already dug its way inside the body of the snail, as if by magic. The shell wasn't going to help the snail here. It was just like what happened to Han Sen before, in which an excruciating amount of pain was dealt, all from the inside of the snail's body. It was literally being killed from the inside out. The bug was very small and rather weak, though. It took the dust bug 2 hours to completely kill the jade snail. Ordinary creature jade snail killed. Beast soul gained. Bronze Geno core received. Jade snail shell. Consume its flesh to gain 0 to 10 ordinary Geno points randomly. Han Sen was delighted to receive both the Geno core and the beast soul. Han Sen threw away the leaves that currently clothed him and summoned the beast soul. A clean, white armor covered his entire body. The only thing missing was a helmet. But even without that, Han Sen found himself pleased and satisfied with his new armor. "Daddy, I want one too." Bauer pulled at Han Sen's leg, as if begging for a set. She was sick and tired of the leaves and pricking twigs that made her skin itch. "Don't worry, I'm going to get you one." Han Sen used his dust bug to take out another snail. 10 hours passed, and when Han Sen slew his 8th jade snail, he managed to obtain a second beast soul. He gave this to Bauer. Han Sen wasn't planning on killing any more than he had to, especially after collecting everything he had been hoping to get. The ratio of Geno core collections far outweighed that of the beast souls, though, for Han Sen had managed to obtain 7 of them. Unfortunately, they were all bronze class, but although they were as small as beans at first, they could be pumped up to the size of a house if they were given a bit of power. Just like the dust bug, they were all of the earth element too. Han Sen used his horns to cut up the snails. He would obtain a hearty amount of Geno points by eating the vast amount he had killed, but he wasn't entirely sure whether or not they were edible. They were toxic, after all, and in fear of this poison, Han Sen made sure to give each slab of meat he cut a good washing. He scrubbed them fiercely and cleaned them up well, but even still, he did not feel safe cooking them up. When the meat had finished sizzling, Bauer looked as hungry as she did the night before. But this time, Han Sen stopped her trying to grab a bite. He had to make sure they were safe to eat first. Han Sen used his horn and stabbed one of the slabs of meat. Then, he chucked it onto the grass a distance away. Then, in a nearby bush, Han Sen made himself comfy. He was going to watch it intently, sitting in silence. A while later, a basketball-sized bug made an appearance. It scurried over towards the meat Han Sen had placed. It was called a snake bug, for its head and neck could elongate. Its jaw was said to be fiercely powerful, and with its teeth, it could snap and chew through steel with ease. The sheep told Han Sen he'd have to be careful if he encountered one, for they rarely let go once they had bitten into something. Furthermore, their fangs injected a lethal poison into their prey. Han Sen wasn't planning on fighting it, though. All he wanted to do was test if the jade snail's poison would damage the snake bug once it had taken a bite. The insect launched its head like the firing of a hookshot. Its teeth sunk into the succulent meat and began to winch back like a chain. Bauer took notice, and she thought it was a theft of great insult. Fortunately, she did not do anything hasty, and as the snake bug gobbled up the slab of meat, it suddenly began to convulse violently. It rolled onto its back and twitched in a ghastly fashion as blisters and boils began to pop up across its body. It started to lash out and writhe around amidst the agony it was suffering, but as it did, the boils and bubbles burst to release disgusting, smelly, slimy juices. Han Sen was shocked at the sight, and he thought it to be a rather revolting scene. The snake bug inflicted poison on others, so it should have had some resilience to the poison of the jade snail. And yet, the fact that it had reacted like this spoke volumes about the toxicity of the poison the jade snails wielded. Eventually, the snake bug stopped moving. It had died. Ordinary creature snake bug killed.
No beast soul gun.
Genocore unobtained. Consume its flesh, gain 0 to 10 ordinary geno points randomly. Han Sen was surprised it counted as a kill. He returned deeper into the valley where the jade snails resided and noticed many more had appeared. They were all busy in the process of consuming their slain brethren. Han Sen chased them all away. The meat of the snails shrunk quite a bit after being cooked, so Han Sen was able to fry a lot to take with him. By the time he was done, he had cooked up 200 kilograms of meat. Han Sen packaged it all up and prepared to move off someplace else. Killing ordinary creatures was not a difficult thing to do, he believed. All he had to do was be careful when dealing with their genocores. Hunting primitive creatures would undoubtedly be difficult, and the need to achieve a fitness level of 10,000 was most certainly no joke. But now that he had all that poisonous meat, he had more than a few ideas about what he might be able to do. The sheep was true to its nature. It liked following others, particularly leaders that were stronger than itself. There was, however, one creature even the sheep was not willing to go near. That creature was a very angry being, and merely venturing past the edges of its territory would have it wanting to kill you. Han Sen brought his meat there to see if he could kill the creature that the sheep feared oh so much. If he was able to kill it, he ran the chance of obtaining a genocore and a beast soul. The creature was a bona fide primitive creature, too. Such treasures would make for some good gear. Furthermore, the creature was said to be fiercely guarding a geno plant. If Han Sen was able to slay the creature, the plant would then belong to him. Holding 200 kilograms of poisonous meat in his arms, he placed it down near a portion of the ground that was split and around 2 meters wide. Han Sen peered down into the pit he had selected and noted how black it was. He then dropped the meat down the hole. He was surprised to hear how long it took for the meat to hit the deck. Han Sen then turned around to run. If he killed the beast he had come for, the announcement would surely play. But as he moved away from the ground, he caught sight of a white fluffy animal. Much to his disappointment, he had encountered the cheap, double-crossing sheep once more. "You cheap sheep. Oh, I'm having mutton tonight," Han Sen yelled as he ran towards the sheep with his horns drawn. The sheep knew he had gone too far the last time they met, and it wasn't likely Han Sen was the sort to let bygones be bygones and let him off the hook. And just as Han Sen caught up to the woolly prat, Han Sen called out, "Cheap sheep, this is your judgment day." The sheep knew he couldn't outrun Han Sen, and so he quickly threw himself onto the ground in a kowtow position. He pleaded, "Spare my life, please." Han Sen felt a chill run down his spine, and he thought to himself, "You asterisk shoal. You tried to kill me. You can't weasel your way out of this one." Han Sen was planning on striking the sheep down, then and there. But just as he was about to, something red appeared in the grass. Han Sen was taken aback. He thought the slippery, worm-tongued cheap sheep had played a magic trick on him. Looking at the red figure that had just appeared on the plain, he noticed it was the chef. Unfortunately for her, she looked to be in very sorry shape, and the red color was the blood that soaked her person. Pang! The chef collapsed on the ground. Han Sen could breathe a sigh of relief, knowing she wasn't a threat, but he also smirked a little as he thought about getting revenge on her. Han Sen pulled out his horns, ready to finish her off, but she managed, with great strain, to look up and mumble a few words. She said, Han, Jean, G. Han Sen immediately withdrew his weapons and bent down near her. He raced to ask, "What did you just say?" She quietly repeated what she had spoken, pauses and all.
Han.
Jean, G. Han Sen now knew he had not been mistaken, hearing what she said. He then recalled the man who had died slumped against the entrance to the underground shelter. After examining the person, Han Sen and his companions had discovered a pocket watch on him. There was an old photo inside, featuring an unknown middle-aged man and his father as a child. Han Sen had asked his mother who the man was, but she did not know who it was either. Now that she had spoken the name Han Jinji, Han Sen thought to himself, what connection does she have to Han Jinji? Might she know who the man holding my father was, the same person who was dead outside the tree door? Han Sen wanted to ask her more questions, but she had passed out. Han Sen wished to wake her up, but before he could do anything, he felt a frightening presence approaching quickly. It was the boss of Jade Hill. There were many beasts following him, like a swarm of locusts. Han Sen picked up the chef and began running. He would have happily killed her earlier, but there was the possibility she held valuable information. He wasn't going to let her die now. If he failed to get her to safety, he wouldn't learn more about his father or find out anything about that photo. Even if she didn't know a whole lot, Han Sen was eager to follow even the most meager trail of breadcrumbs he could find, if it meant securing a lead around the mysteries that surrounded his father. Han Sen ran off like a madman, with the chef on his shoulders. Unfortunately, he was unable to go at a pace quick enough to shake off the tide of beasts behind him and the wretched spirit who commanded them. After running for a while, Han Sen's eyes traced a sheep running in the distance. He imagined the fluffy fiend had managed to get away while he was busy examining the chef. It was a slow creature, though, and it wasn't long before Han Sen caught up with it. "Bossman bub, don't kill me. I'll do whatever you want," the sheep pleaded and begged, as its little legs carried it as fast as they could. "Stand right there, then."
Han Sen shouted.
"No can do. Are you blind to the army that's chasing us, bub?" The sheep wasn't willing to follow the command and simply kept on running. F***CKU, Han Sen said, keeping up with the sheep. Across that emerald expanse, the sheep was leading the chase. Han Sen was directly behind it, while a massive swarm of creatures chased at a good few paces behind. "Stop right now."
No.
"Stop."
No.
Han Sen knew he wasn't going to listen, so he exerted more energy to try to outpace the sheep. The beasts were catching up, too, and they didn't look as if they were going to get winded anytime soon. The sheep, seeing that Han Sen was about to overtake him, summoned its horn and fired it towards him. Han Sen, seeing the boomerang come for him, employed his phoenix techniques to swoop across and over the sheep. The sheep was not very proficient when it came to combat, and after leaping towards it, Han Sen grabbed the sheep by its neck and lobbed it at the swarm of creatures behind. "Go make him your boss," Han Sen shouted out. Han Sen believed the sheep might actually get the job done. After the sheep was launched towards the self-proclaimed boss of the Jade Hill, Han Sen saw the boss raise his hands towards it. The sheep immediately pleaded, "Boss, don't kill me. I'm coming to serve and obey you." After the sheep called this out, the boss frowned. He wasn't impressed. He grabbed hold of the sheep and cast it away like a stone. Han Sen, seeing cheap sheep earn itself another boss, hoped someone or something might suddenly appear to kill it. Strangely, nothing happened, and the monsters continued to chase him. Han Sen was just testing it out, though. He didn't think the death of leaders was some sort of curse or ability cheap sheep inherently had, but he was curious nonetheless. So, he had no choice but to continue running. The oppressive atmosphere propagated by those behind him was incredibly strong, though, and Han Sen could not keep up at the rapid pace he was going. He knew he'd not be able to escape, no matter how long he went for. So, he gritted his teeth and launched himself back towards the boss of Jade Hill. Han Sen was thinking to himself, "Come on, don't stop me. I just need to get a little closer." The boss of Jade Hill's beasts would be difficult for Han Sen to tackle mano a mano, and if he found himself bearing the brunt of one's attack, he could find himself in a similar condition to that of the chef. If Han Sen could just about reach the boss, he could use Super Spank to deliver enough damage to kill it and end the threat for good. But Han Sen had to physically touch his opponent with his hand to use Super Spank. Getting that close was a dangerous feat, and it was a stunt he wasn't entirely sure he could pull off. Han Sen was still a good distance away from his foe, and the tide of monsters was already headed his way. With the chef in one arm and a horn in the other, he stood strong and broke the wave. He managed to slay every creature that dared to come near him. Why am I so unlucky, huh? No one has come to help kill this guy. Han Sen was disheartened. The boss of Jade Hill looked at Han Sen with a strange expression. The human had achieved the power of a primitive creature, but he had no Geno core. The boss had initially only wanted to kill the chef, but he couldn't allow a human like that to run rampant. He had to make Han Sen his target now, as well, and not only the chef. Han Sen's jade skin had a high threshold of stamina, but he had been running for a long time already. Having exhausted much of his energy, Han Sen knew he couldn't keep on fighting the onslaught of creatures that were spawned to impede him. As he had seen with the chef previously, the boss could generate creatures continually, almost faster than he could kill them. If he kept this up, he'd become winded and fall. How am I supposed to get out of this? Han Sen asked himself, looking around for a solution to his woes. The boss of Jade Hill was too far away from Han Sen, and with the barrage of monsters that kept on coming, it didn't look likely he'd reach the spirit. Things were different in the fourth god's sanctuary, and there was a perpetual sense of unease. The atmosphere and gravitas of every situation were heavy, and this was only tripled under the threat of those creatures. And with everything being so strong, the powers he might have once used to sunder mountains in the third god's sanctuary could only manage to split rocks here. A weak, new demigod to the fourth god's sanctuary did not have to encounter a creature or spirit to meet a grisly end. Han Sen wagered the atmosphere itself could choke the life out of them. Han Sen had a few AoE hyper-geno arts that could hit multiple opponents at once, but they wouldn't be of much use here. And again, that was mainly because he lacked a Geno core to call his own. He had to use his body to fight, just as it was. As such, his attacks had to be singular, too. I can't turn back now. I must do this. Han Sen then decided to take off running towards the split earth. He had wanted to poison the creature that resided within, but now, provided it hadn't yet died, he thought it might be possible to enlist its aid. Han Sen bought himself time by breaking the bodies and cutting the throats of all the creatures that came close. But when he killed one, the body would explode into a whiff of black smoke and respawn. Han Sen's arm was dealt a scratch at one point, but Jade skin proved sufficient to withstand the light fumbles he made. He didn't even end up bleeding. He was still a good distance away from the split earth. He regretted running as far as he had, for it now proved rather difficult to return. The boss of Jade Hill was getting peeved as this transpired. He was annoyed the beasts were unable to do Han Sen harm, so he cast even more powers into the pages of the book he wielded. Then, the bronze book turned to silver. Han Sen's mood turned grim upon seeing this. It was a Knight-class spirit, and that meant his Geno core had probably turned silver-class. Silver Geno cores would create far stronger enemies and generate a threat Han Sen might not be able to overcome. And to coincide with this, the boss's temperament looked disturbingly ill. When he drew with his fingertips, he drew carefully and concisely. He wasn't scrawling across the pages wildly as he had been. He was now more deliberate. Han Sen saw a silver light beam from out of the new and improved book, and it spawned a silver-winged ape creature that was able to fly directly over to Han Sen.
Young.
Han Sen punched the ape with a mighty release of energy, which had it stumbling back 10 meters. This guy must be primitive.
Han Sen frov ned.
The boss of Jade Hill continued to draw, but Han Sen noticed the trickles of sweat that were rolling down his forehead like a number of beads. Clearly, The repeated casting of these greater creatures was taking its toll on the spirit. After summoning 4 of those apes, he stopped. Han Sen was in a bad situation, and he had to use jade skin to equalize his fitness with theirs. Han Sen had to deal with 4 horribly powerful apes and a tide of regular creatures, all by his lonesome. Han Sen used jade skin and his phoenix techniques, trying to use these enemies for cover. He didn't make use of super spank, though, for he was afraid he'd spook the boss into running away if it found out what Han Sen was capable of. And Han Sen wasn't in the mood to make lasting enemies, either, so the threat of the self-proclaimed boss had to end there and then. Han Sen wanted to fight the boss right then. Exerting his strength to take down the apes was a waste of both time and energy. He was starting to incur wounds, too, as the brutal hits delivered by the apes were making him bleed. After a long fight, Han Sen felt a strange power begin to well up inside his body. It felt as if his very cells were being empowered by jade skin. Han Sen was enthused, feeling this. He was feeling the same sensations old Manji had once described to him. Is my Geno core generating? Han Sen asked himself with gleeful surprise. It was different than the typical flow of energy. This time, Han Sen's body was generating a strange substance that was new to him. It came out of his cells and went to sit in his sea of soul. And as this transparent substance gathered together, he was able to see it clearly. The substance was a little like water, but thick like a gel. It was like a non-Newtonian fluid, but different as well. It was difficult for Han Sen to determine what it was, exactly. Han Sen already knew different hyper-geno arts could produce different geno cores, and because he'd been using jade skin, that was what he used to generate his first. The substance that was bleeding into the sea of soul continued to amass and compose its form, all as one. Unfortunately, Han Sen had no time to watch the process. He was still under fire and had to fight back the army of creatures, but there at least seemed to be a light at the end of that very long tunnel. All he had to do now was hold them back and allow the process of the Geno core's production to finish. Furthermore, Han Sen could not control the shape or form the substance was building. The finished Geno core was not something sculpted by the person's desire. It was constructed through the host's genes under the influence of their hyper-geno art. They themselves had no personal hand in it. As Han Sen battled his way through the tide, he felt something amiss in his sea of soul. Something else was occurring. Han Sen took a peek back inside his sea of soul, and there, he saw his black crystal glowing. It was generating another substance, something black, and this substance was mixing in with the Geno core that was currently in production. The Geno core was transparent, but the black substance was darker than dark. It was blacker than ink. It was concerning. When the two mixed together, though, the overall substance looked like cream. But this intrusive substance did not enlarge the form of the Geno core that was being built. Instead, it was acting like a light tincture that altered its color. Han Sen wished to stop the black crystal from interrupting or possibly damaging the process, but he found himself unable to. And from this black crystal, more and more liquid began to ooze. Han Sen then noticed a change in the crystal's form. It had become smaller, somehow. Throughout its time in 3 sanctuaries, it hadn't once changed its shape. But now, it was. Whether that was a good omen or a bad one, he could not tell. Han Sen was unable to play any part in the formation of the Geno core, and all he could do was allow the events transpiring in his sea of soul to play out. But once the black crystal had shrunk by 10%, it stopped shrinking. The creamy Geno core began to look like an enclosed flower on the precipice of opening in full bloom. This was also the point Han Sen acknowledged to be the most crucial moment. He eagerly anticipated the reveal of the Geno core and the effect the black crystal had had on it. Han Sen was unable to watch it constantly, though. He feared he might miss the initial reveal due to the constant pressure the 4 silver-winged apes were putting on him. And then, a vibration, like a violent tremor, sent shockwaves through his body and sea of soul. It was like a high-magnitude earthquake. When Han Sen popped his head in to take a look once more, he was shocked. What is this? What is it? Han Sen wondered. Sitting inside the sea of soul was a cream-colored item. It looked like a ceramic object. Its shape was very strange, however. It was oval, not too far off the shape of an egg. Has it not finished yet? Do I need to fetch a spoon and break the top off? Han Sen wondered. Leaning in for a closer look, Han Sen checked out its basic info. Self-Geno Core, Bronze Crystal Core. Han Sen was frozen. He was not expecting to receive something special, but he didn't expect to receive something so inherently dull and basic as that, either. A lame name didn't always mean something was poor, but something as horrendous and plain as Crystal Core was awful. It was as uninspired as its shape. Han Sen thought he'd receive a weapon like the chef possessed. He thought he'd get something that would help him out of his current predicament, but all he had received was an egg. Not wanting to remain a pessimist, though, Han Sen decided to look on the bright side and say, well, looks can be deceiving. Never judge a book by its cover. Never judge a Geno Core by its shape. It might actually be really powerful. Han Sen decided to summon the egg Geno Core. The creamy, egg-shaped crystal appeared in front of Han Sen. It hovered in the air before him. Han Sen commanded it to strike one of the beasts near him. Seeing the egg go for the creatures, Han Sen wondered to himself, I wonder if this will strike them like a bullet? Or better yet, work like a grenade and explode. Han Sen didn't want to be so negative, so he remained optimistic and hoped for the best. After all, the crystal had been generated by jade skin. Perhaps it was just the appearance of the item that was lame. The egg struck the head of one of the monsters as Han Sen crossed his fingers and waited for a miracle to happen. Bauer grasped Han Sen's neck so she could lean forward and squint, equally excited to see what might happen next. Then, a second later, their eyes opened wide as if they had just encountered a ghost. But it was all for the wrong reasons. The egg hit the forehead of a creature, and that was it. There was no explosion. The ape did not even reel back in pain. Like a bouncy ball, it bounced back. Han Sen could not believe he had generated something so useless. And due to the item's oval shape, it bounced off in a different direction and drifted off behind Han Sen.